Harry the Spy, The Mysterious Snow. Chapter 1. Psst! Harry looked up. Psst! The noise was coming from the spy hole in the garden fence. Harry peered through the small hole. The leafy foliage of summer had gone, and only stark, bare twigs interrupted his view of Mrs. Joyce's brown eyes. "What was the message, Harry?" she asked urgently. "It was from Caccabanjo," said Harry. "And?" prompted Mrs. Joyce. Harry paused, then, "Have you ever been to Caccabanjo?" he asked. Mrs. Joyce nodded. "My brother says it doesn't even exist," said Harry. "But has he ever been there?" asked Mrs. Joyce. Harry shook his head. "Well then, how would he know?" Harry shrugged. She was right, of course. How could he know? Mrs. Joyce asked eagerly, "What was the message, Harry?" Harry screwed up his eyes and focused. He must recollect as exactly as he could the information he had heard. Any detail might be vital to save his country. He had written phrases on the handy piece of paper he kept for such eventualities. The "just in case" piece of paper was rolled up in a tight tube and kept in a plastic capsule that slotted into the side of his field agent spy watch. He removed the paper, and Mrs. Joyce drew nearer, paying close attention. You see, Harry was a spy, not a boy who only thought he was, not just pretending with all the gadgets he had received as gifts, but Harry really was a spy. He was also a good spy. He took his instructions from the Key to Life book, as we shall find out later in the story. Of course, plenty of people didn't think he was a spy. He was only a schoolboy after all. His parents didn't seem to believe him, even though they were kind about it and said things like, "That's nice, dear," when he explained about the secret codes and messages he really truly could hear. His older brother and sisters didn't believe him either, because Harry seemed to be the only one who could do all these spy-like things. Others couldn't when they tried. Only Harry could see through walls, although the view was always quite shadowy and vague, with the X-ray vision binoculars his aunt had brought him from Amazon for Christmas. He was the only one who could hear secret messages with the ear extension Grandad and Grandma bought him for his birthday. The motion alarm worked best for him. Only Harry could truly see in the dark with the night spire, and so it was with the rest of his spy gear as well. Nobody else seemed to understand, apart from his friend Mrs. Joyce. Mrs. Joyce was, in fact, Miss Joyce Fremantle. Harry didn't know this was her proper name. To him and his brother and sisters, the old lady who lived next door had always simply been Mrs. Joyce. Mrs. Joyce wasn't like other old ladies, who might have been fussy and particular and not understand about children who were noisy and messy. Mrs. Joyce understood. She kicked their footballs back over the fence. She never complained about their noise. She never complained about anything. She took a special interest in Harry's spy gear, quite often borrowing items from him and mending and improving them. It was no surprise to Mrs. Joyce that Harry had overheard a secret message from Caccabanjo. She expected these things to happen. It was no surprise to Harry that Mrs. Joyce appeared at the spy hole just when he was trying to figure out the mysterious code he had recorded. She always seemed to know when he needed help. Mrs. Joyce waited while Harry carefully examined the information he had logged from the Caccabangian message. His pencil was unfortunately blunt. In addition, he had nothing to lean on but an old tree, so all in all his writing was a bit messy. Slowly Harry read his notes. They said OPERA 20 IO 14 -1914 OW is all go. You're sure the second bit was 1914 OW? Yes, said Harry. Snow, mused Mrs Joyce, not seeming particularly surprised. Snow? Definitely snow. They're using a very crude code, probably so they don't use key words which might alert MI5, who of course will be listening. Or perhaps their code is simply to confuse any casual listener such as yourself, though of course they weren't to know you'd decipher it. Harry wasn't sure he'd deciphered anything. So the code they used... They've just substituted numbers for specific letters of the alphabet. So we know it's Operation Snow. What else? I missed a bit, and then there were numbers after that which I wrote down. 08 12 1650. HOUR 19. I thought that might be the time with the hour 19 bit, but I'm not sure. Good thinking, said Mrs Joyce. I think hour 19 spells out hours, with S being the 19th letter of the alphabet. But what is worrying is the date. 0812? asked Harry. If I'm right, it stands for the 8th of the 12th month, but the 8th of December is... The day after tomorrow, said Harry. Exactly. We don't have much time. Mrs Joyce was very clever. Harry was certain she had once been a top secret spy. Perhaps she still was. He wondered how many real-life, dangerous and deadly puzzles she solved when she was working as a spy. It would fit in with the bigger picture, Mrs Joyce was muttering to herself. I wonder if it could possibly be, and we've hardly got any time at all. What? Harry asked eagerly. What could it be? Never mind that now, said Mrs Joyce, which Harry knew meant that he would probably never find out. For now, it's important to go through the detail. What else did you hear? Tell me as exactly as you can. Something about small 12O14 DO14. Using the same code. Is it London? Asked Harry. I probably got the small bit muddled. They must have meant the big city of London. Or could it be Londonderry House? Though that's pretty big too. Or is small code for big? Harry realised that it wasn't particularly helpful to identify the city of London as the scene for a terrorist plot, since it was such a large place, and anything could be, and probably was, happening there. Perhaps there was a street called Small in London. Mrs Joyce said briskly, At any rate, I don't think it's Londonderry House, although that place could certainly bear investigation, but... Harry wondered if he would ever learn why Mrs Joyce thought that the large, stately home called Londonderry House, close to where he lived, might need investigating. But Mrs Joyce didn't stop to explain. Instead she continued, I think small means little, Little London. Harry didn't respond to that suggestion. For anything to be happening in the sleepy, respectable village of Little London, a few miles from his house, was ridiculous, and he was sure Mrs Joyce would see that too. Londonderry House might have all the necessary history, and cellars and dungeons, and suits of armour, to be the scene of a fantastic terrorist plot, but not Little London. But then Harry realised he had written down something else. Wait, 14-3-C-3-C. That's what they also mentioned. But if 3 is C in their code, that's probably too many C's. N-C-C-C-C? Or not enough, so maybe I got that bit confused too. Harry was a little ashamed of his muddled scribblings, but it was hard to write everything down in the correct order when a message came through. But there were definitely quite a few C's in it, he added. Good, very good, Harry. What else? Mrs Joyce sounded urgent and excited. Harry was pleased. He tried to remember if there was anything else at all that might help. I think that was all, he admitted reluctantly after a pause. What will we do now?" "I think we need to visit London," said Mrs Joyce. "Perhaps we'll try the small version first." Chapter 2. Mrs Joyce paid Mum a visit that evening. Harry was doing his homework at the kitchen table. Mrs Joyce winked at him as she placed a lovely homemade apple pie on the table. "I had so many stewed apples I made 2 pies, Sylvie," she said. "I thought you could use one." "So kind," said Mum. "You always do so much for us, Joyce. You really shouldn't have gone to all that trouble." Adults always said things like that, and adults always kept going to the trouble. Mum and Mrs Joyce moved further away from the table, and Mum flicked on the kettle. Harry tried to pretend he was concentrating on his homework, but instead he removed his ear extension earpiece from his pencil case, deftly flicked the small switch to Home, and stuck it in his ear. If he had flicked it to the mysterious other setting, he might have heard secret messages, such as the one he had heard earlier about Caccabanjo. The ear extension looked like the hearing aid that Mrs Joyce wore, certainly not mysterious. Everyone in Harry's family was used to seeing it stuck in one ear. Nobody believed he heard anything special with it. Once Harry put the earpiece in, the conversation between Mum and Mrs Joyce suddenly became much, much louder, even above the noise of the kettle. Mrs Joyce was saying, "I wondered if I could borrow Harry again. I could pick him up from school if you can spare him." "Tea or coffee?" asked Mum. "I've got some of that nice Earl Grey you enjoy." "How lovely! Yes, the Earl Grey by all means. You see, Harry is such a helpful boy." "I'm sure he is." Mum sounded amused. "Oh, he is, I assure you. So if I could—" "Of course, I know he's always safe with you," said Mum. Both of them chuckled, although Harry didn't see what was funny. "I'll expect him home for tea. I wonder if I could give him tea too. There are a couple of projects he could help me with." Mum waved a hand expansively through the air. "Home for bed by 8 p.m. then," she said. Harry was sure that Mum didn't understand why Mrs Joyce needed his help. Mum knew that Mrs Joyce kindly supported Harry's interest in the world of spies, but there was something about this eavesdropped conversation that almost sounded as if Mum was in on the secret too. It couldn't be the case, of course. Mum didn't understand about spies and such stuff, did she? Harry doodled on his maths homework. He didn't particularly enjoy maths, but he did enjoy writing numbers and changing their appearance and disguising them, much as he might do when he was writing in a special code. All of a sudden he stopped, went very still, and stared at the numbers he had previously drawn on the opposite page. Only yesterday he had been disguising his 7 to look like an 8, which was pretty tricky considering they weren't similar at all. In the end, he had decided he could simply substitute one for the other, making the 7 a bit squiggly with extra lines coming off, and the 8 a bit straighter with faint lines for the round bits, which would indicate to him that he was writing in code. But the secret message, the one he had told Mrs Joyce about, the one he and Mrs Joyce were going to explore tomorrow. What if the 8 was intended to be a 7? Harry couldn't for the life of him remember whether he'd used his secret code or not. The spy message he'd written leaning on the bumpy tree bark was so messy it didn't give him any clues at all. But if 8 was actually 7, then the date wasn't the 8th of December, but the 7th. What if it was tomorrow? Perhaps Mrs Joyce's extraordinary powers of perception made her realize what had just occurred to Harry, or perhaps she merely decided to take a seat at the table by him with her mug of Earl Grey tea, while Mum cut up some lemon cake to eat. "Maths homework, Harry?" she asked, her eyes on the exercise book full of messy scribbling. You see here, Harry placed his pen to point to the numbers he had jotted, 8s that looked like 7s and vice versa. I think 8 might be 7, you see, he said. Thankfully, Mrs. Joyce always immediately saw what others did not. Yes, she said, I see. Mrs. Joyce didn't stay long after that. I've just remembered some phone calls I should make, Sylvie, she said. Sorry to dash. Mum saw her to the door. Mrs. Joyce only had to walk out of their driveway and around the corner to her own house next door. Mum watched until she turned the corner, waving a hand until Mrs. Joyce disappeared from sight. Harry imagined the world of secret lines and communications that Mrs. Joyce must know all about, that she might even now be tapping into. Did she use Morse code, or have a hotline to the Prime Minister? Did she have secret agents living in her large attic, ready to carry messages to London? What about the stone outbuildings that were padlocked shut, and which Mrs. Joyce carefully guarded? Mrs. Joyce's house and grounds were full of hidden mysteries. To Harry, it seemed like exactly the type of place from which to overthrow a dastardly plot threatening their country. Tomorrow, Harry and Mrs. Joyce might have to save the world. Chapter 3. After school the next day, Mrs. Joyce drove Harry in her battered ancient car to the nearby village of Little London. Often Harry felt frustrated at the unexciting, sleepy villages by which his world was bounded. Places such as Bramley Hedge, Windy Alley, and his own safe, uninspiring hamlet of Lower Misling. There was not one single exciting thing that happened in these respectable villages that could make anyone imagine there might be a terrorist plot right here which could cause disaster to their nation. Surely there were no enemy spies here that would harm anyone. There were places close by where dark plots and desperate sabotage could be imagined, like Mizzle Abbey ruin, where ghosts were supposed to roam. People often stopped and took pictures of the ruin, and the tumblestones certainly looked spooky, but there was precious little concealed space for anyone to hide or carry out an act of terrorism. The abandoned, decaying Mizzle Hall might conceivably be home to outlaws and bandits, though, or the stately Londonderry House, which Mrs. Joyce had already discounted. But surely not the leafy habitation which was Little London. "I've been very busy today, as you would expect," Mrs. Joyce was saying. "Phone calls to MI5 and MI6 too. I think we've stirred up some interest, but they're just not taking this seriously enough. I have a feeling in my bones about this one, and as you know, my bones are never wrong." Harry nodded. He trusted as implicitly as Mrs. Joyce did in her bones. He didn't ask many questions. Mrs. Joyce always spoke to him as if he knew precisely what was going on, and sooner or later he figured it out. "I've packed the Arctic gear," confided Mrs. Joyce. "I thought it best to be prepared. No new messages, I suppose?" Harry shook his head. He had been listening all day to the other channel on his earpiece, until his teacher confiscated his ear extension altogether. "Mrs. Penn took it from me in class," he said. Mrs. Joyce was comfortingly indignant. "Ridiculous," she said. "We've got a national emergency, the very security of our nation might be at stake, and teachers have no sense of perspective on the matter at all. Honestly, you would think—" "I got it back," said Harry. "You did? Just as well. Yes, start listening. Quick now, there may be an update we can tap into. Keep it on the other channel for now. And did you bring the locator I gave you? That's it. Well done. Lovely to have such a reliable spy. Switch it to searching for trouble. Now, keep an eye on the locator and an ear for any sound whatsoever." Harry held the large antique compass, known as the locator, that Mrs. Joyce had given him. She had unearthed it from her mysterious attic, which contained all sorts of interesting devices. The locator wasn't your average compass, although it did display north, south, east and west. But Mrs. Joyce said that was to disguise its real purpose. It was the other messages around the dial of the locator which were the important part of it. In small, carved, beautifully spidery writing, there were settings such as searching for trouble, which was the setting Harry had just used, finding help, need a friend, solve a puzzle, and other quite peculiar things. You twisted the inner dial to the setting you needed, and something would happen. At least, so Mrs. Joyce said. Harry was forbidden to use it except on a real mission. He was always glad to have the excuse to get it out of its old cardboard box where he kept it under his bed. Over the bare winter fields, Harry could see the buildings that formed Pig's Bottom Farm. A small lane turned in that direction, along which was a smattering of large, well-to-do houses. A short distance further, they entered the village of Little London. It had a "Please drive carefully" sign beneath the usual black and white name sign that marked the entrance. Mrs. Joyce took the right-hand turn onto the main street. It was lined with houses that looked snug and secure, as if they knew quite well there was nothing to be concerned about. It was so disappointingly normal that Harry, despite his great faith in Mrs. Joyce, could not help but feel that they had got the wrong direction. If anything interesting and dangerous was happening, if enemy spies were lurking anywhere, it must surely be in the real city of London, not in such safe, mundane surroundings. They passed solid brick homes behind thick fir hedges, whitewashed houses, thatched cottages that looked as nice as the ones on postcards, and the Crooked Man Inn, where they would soon be serving evening meals to people who were discussing business and planning Christmas, and had no thought of danger being within 50 miles. Mrs. Joyce took a couple of turns off the main street, slowly passing down the safe lanes that snaked around the housing areas of Little London, linking all the small parts of it together in a secure chain. A few early Christmas trees twinkled from windows. TV was on in living rooms. Kids ate snacks after school and squabbled. All around them things were carrying on as normal. It seemed that only Harry and Mrs. Joyce suspected otherwise. Once they were back on the main street, they drove all the way through the village, and absolutely nothing happened. Harry held the locator, and the needle simply quivered with the movement of the bumpy old car, as if it was broken. There was nothing interesting coming through Harry's earpiece either. Harry could hear snatches of conversation between two women who were comparing the quality of supermarket turkeys, but there was nothing that indicated there was about to be an attack on his country. It wasn't unusual to pick up other bits and pieces. Not everything he heard was the business of a spy, but it was important to listen to everything and then decide what was important. That's what Mrs. Joyce always said. They drove through the tree tunnel towards the far boundary of the village, where there were no houses at all. They passed through dense woodland, with bare, stretching tree branches over thick, tangled undergrowth and tumbled piles of leaves. Mrs. Joyce pulled into the entrance to a field. Through the skeletal trees and between huge evergreen firs, several large business buildings were only just visible. The trees appeared to close right around the compound like a prickly perimeter. At least, it looked prickly with all the bare branches. In summer, it might have looked leafy and friendly. Mrs. Joyce turned the car around. She seemed unperturbed that nothing was happening in Little London, and she headed the car back to the village to once more drive its sleepy streets. They were certainly obeying the "Please drive carefully" sign. Mrs. Joyce didn't care about the big 4x4 that roared up behind them as they crawled along at a snail's pace. Harry glanced back at the man driving the large vehicle. He was big and intimidating, and was wearing dark glasses, despite it not being sunny. Mrs. Joyce carried on regardless. She was peering into the same patch of woodland which enclosed the business park that they had already passed. The 4x4 rushed through the narrow entrance into the wood, down the track into the trees. A large sign at the entrance said, "Entry to business premises only. 24-hour security on site." Harry wasn't sure why they'd need that much security, but if anywhere in this poky place was likely to house the NCCCC, however many C's there were, it was probably the business park at the end of the track down which the daunting four-wheel drive vehicle had just rushed. And then Harry saw it. A sign, smallish and not particularly inspiring, listing a number of businesses that had premises in the Little London Business Park. Among them was one for the Nature Care, Control and Conservation Centre. "That's it," said Harry. "The NCCCC." Chapter 4. Mrs. Joyce pulled the car to the side of the road, bumping into a pothole. "What did you say, Harry?" "The NCCC. It's on that sign. Remember the letters in the code? It must be that place back there." Mrs. Joyce didn't turn to look at the sign. Instead, she looked at the old locator in Harry's hand. The locator wasn't moving at all. "Anything on the ear extension?" she asked. Harry shook his head. "There were two women talking about cheap turkeys," he said. "We'll keep moving," Mrs. Joyce decided. "We're not giving up yet. If we can't find anything else, we'll go down the track to the nature conservation place you spotted. But it doesn't seem the right way to me, not the way we need to take at all." Harry realized that not only had Mrs. Joyce also spotted the sign, she had read what it stood for too. There weren't many people about as they drove back through Little London. The short December day was chilly and uninviting, and a fine misty rain had begun to fall. A couple of kids were late walking home from school. They stared at Mrs. Joyce's funny old car as they passed, and then laughed. Harry stared back indignantly. A couple of women were chatting at a bus stop. To Harry they looked like any normal women, such as his teachers at school. But as they drove past, Harry looked at them more closely. Their words and gestures seemed to match the conversation continuing in his earpiece. "They're talking about snow at Christmas time now," he said. "Who?" asked Mrs. Joyce urgently. "The two ladies at the bus stop we just passed. I think they were the ones talking about turkeys, and now they're talking about snow." Mrs. Joyce pressed a button on her ancient car dashboard. The button blended in with the other car controls, between the fog lights and the heating dial. "I don't think they can be involved," said Harry. "They look like—" He trailed off. He remembered what Mrs. Joyce said about spies. They looked normal. They blended in. Of course, Mrs. Joyce also said that sometimes people were exactly what they seemed, ordinary people who weren't spies at all. It was hard to tell which category these two women fell into. They didn't look like they were involved in a conspiracy about anything, but then neither did real spies. Mrs. Joyce read his thoughts. "They look ordinary," agreed Mrs. Joyce, "but so do we. Who would suspect an old woman and a schoolboy are capable of saving our country from destruction? But that's exactly what we might have to do." Suddenly, instead of the speedometer showing them toddling through Little London at 28 miles per hour, an image appeared, that of the two women at the bus stop. It was a clear camera image, and it was recording the women's every move. Mrs. Joyce explained, "It's one of my new remote control cameras. It's almost invisible on the road behind us. It looks like a loose stone, and it's indestructible if it's run over. It'll send an image through a signal to my dashboard. If the women move, we might be able to maneuver the camera to follow them, but we'll watch them in the meantime. We'll park here." She pulled into a parking space at the front of the Crooked Man Inn. The people in the inn could see them, but Mrs. Joyce was quite right when she said that she and Harry didn't look suspicious at all. In fact, she looked like an old lady who had lost her way. She hauled her large handbag from the back seat and handed it to Harry. "You must be hungry. We can eat while we're on surveillance. There are some sandwiches in there, and crisps and some cookies." The sandwiches were delicious, and Harry made short work of the cookies. But surveillance work was dull despite the food that helped to pass the time. They watched the image of the two women at the bus stop on the car dashboard. One was looking at her watch. The other glanced around uncertainly. They evidently didn't know they were being watched, and every movement took on new, menacing meaning. A bus pulled into the stop, and a very young man, no more than a teenager, disembarked. He approached the two women, and a short conversation took place. One of the women made some hand gestures, as if she was giving directions. The teenage boy turned, and for the first time the remote control camera showed a clear image of his face. "Well, well," said Mrs. Joyce, "my bones were right again. I never would have thought that he would be involved in... But never mind about that. The point is, the plot is about to begin, and we must stop it." Chapter 5. Mrs. Joyce rummaged in her capacious bag, ignoring the badly wrapped remaining sandwiches that Harry had tossed back inside, and removed a battered old walkie-talkie. At least, that's what it looked like on the outside. She flipped up a screen, and Harry gaped at the shining new smartphone that was concealed within. "They got me an update at last," said Mrs. Joyce carelessly. She never said who they were. She held the device up and snapped a distant photo of the young man, who was not only looking in their direction, but was now coming their way. He had fair hair, and just now he looked very serious. His eyes were concealed behind thick-rimmed glasses, and to Harry he didn't look like the stereotypical criminal, big and fierce and scowling. Instead, he looked like a short-sighted student who had just had a bad day. Mrs. Joyce rapidly pressed keys on the phone, and the photo made a whooshing sound as it went through the airwaves, or internet waves, or phone waves, or however she sent it, maybe even through waves she had invented, to important people in the government. At least, that's what Harry supposed. "Now they must take us seriously," she said. "Who is he?" asked Harry, watching the approaching teenager. "Well, I've never met him, but he's on the authorities' radar, and he has the reputation of being brilliantly clever. I thought he was on our side, but who knows what he's doing mixed up in this affair. Since our incompetent agents haven't turned up here in time, we must follow him and find out." The teenager was already closing in on them, making rapid strides to the car park in which Mrs. Joyce's funny old car was badly parked. At last the locator device began to move. It shook in Harry's hand, the needle fidgeting furiously and wavering around, trouble found, before making a further jerky move to helpful clue. Mrs. Joyce was disgusted with the locator. She scolded it sternly. "It's a bit late for that," she said to it. "Put it away, Harry, in your rucksack. It might sulk for a while, but it serves it right for not being clearer." Until that moment, Harry was unaware that he had a rucksack. Not his school one, which was at his feet and contained his school books, odd spy bits and pieces he liked to keep handy, and leftover bits of food, but a new lightweight one that Mrs. Joyce produced from behind his seat, "Put anything you think you might need in here," she said, "and you must take this rucksack with you wherever you go in case we get separated. Remember, it's got all you need, even for Arctic conditions. And turn your ear extension to home now, so I can communicate with you. We must act as if you and I are innocently waiting for someone. We must not be noticeable. This could be a very dangerous situation. You or I must keep that young man in sight. You're wearing your spy belt? Good. And you've got your wrist blaster on, and your spy glasses handy? Yes, perhaps put them on now. Then you won't be caught unawares." All the time she was speaking, Mrs. Joyce was observing the teenager, who was getting nearer. Just as he reached them, she pulled a pack of old photos from her bag and began to show them to Harry. Some of them were even black and white. Harry was good at acting his part, and did his bit, looking interested, and not looking at the approaching stranger at all. But they needn't have worried that the strange spy, if he really was that, was interested in them. They looked so innocent that he simply walked past the car and straight into the Crooked Man Inn. Just like that, he vanished from sight. "Quickly now, Harry," said Mrs. Joyce. "We know what we must do." Harry didn't exactly know any detail, but he realized that the young man must not be let out of sight. Together, Mrs. Joyce and Harry entered the picturesque inn. There was a lovely open fire burning brightly in the grate. A few early customers sat around enjoying the warmth and calm of a quiet country inn. A real Christmas tree was in place in the corner, and a rendition of Jingle Bells was playing softly in the background. The teenager had approached the landlord behind the counter. Mrs. Joyce made a quick movement with her hand, and immediately Harry sent a small dart flying from his wrist blaster towards the teenager's conversation. It landed expertly, nicely concealed beneath the lip of the counter. Harry fiddled with his earpiece as Mrs. Joyce made normal conversation about what treat Harry might like, as if he was a small boy, not a real spy in training. The young man vanished through a door at the side of the counter. "I need the toilet," Harry said to Mrs. Joyce, and she understood at once. Harry had overheard the conversation through the minute microphone on the dart, which had been relayed to his ear extension earpiece. The young man was headed for the toilets. "Off you go then, dear," Mrs. Joyce said, smiling at all the people around and at the landlord too. "I'll be here when you get back." A few folks smiled at the sight they made, the sweet old lady taking her young charge out for a treat. Mrs. Joyce walked past the counter, discreetly removed the dart, and placed it in her bag. Then she took a seat by the fire and opened a random newspaper. Through her spy-glasses, similar to the ones that Harry was wearing, except that they were also real glasses and she always wore them, she could see through small angled mirrors in every direction. She settled down to see what would happen next. Chapter 6. To Harry's surprise, the young man entered the men's toilets and simply went to the toilet. At least, he went into a cubicle and then flushed the toilet, and then came out again and even washed his hands. Harry did the same. "Hello," said the teenager cheerfully. He had a normal accent, like anyone else that Harry knew. There wasn't a trace of anything sinister about him. It seemed so unlikely that he had even read a spy book, let alone trained as an enemy agent. He had twinkly blue eyes, and his thick-rimmed glasses made him look very clever. But then Harry realized he was wearing similar glasses himself. "Hello," returned Harry. "I like your watch," said the other. Harry shrugged. He was alarmed that the young man had noticed his special field agent spy watch. It made him feel as if his cover might be blown. Harry felt it best to play dumb. He took his phone out of his pocket and pretended he was playing a game on it. He looked bored and quite rude too, ignoring everything else around him. Mrs Joyce would have said he looked like a normal boy, one of those kids who were always glued to devices and whose manners and conversation had been obliterated somewhere along the way. Harry's phone wasn't a phone at all, but a prop, a good imitation that Mrs Joyce had bought so that Harry blended in. "We must make sure you look as ignorant as some other children do," she had said when she gave it to him. Right now Mrs Joyce would have been proud of how ignorant Harry looked. The young man gave up on Harry and left. Harry slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then, very casually, in case anyone was watching, he followed. Outside the toilets there was a corridor that led back to the main lounge of the inn, which Harry and the young man had both come from, or further into the recesses of the old building, where guests weren't intended to be. A couple of doors opened off the corridor. Harry glanced both ways up and down the passageway. There was no sight of the stranger at all. He appeared to have vanished into thin air, and yet Harry had been quite close behind him. Quickly, Harry considered the options. The boy couldn't have returned to the main lounge area, or he would still be in sight in the corridor. However, there were 2 doors close at hand, and he might have had time to go through one of these and disappear. Harry would have to try both doors and then update Mrs Joyce. First, he tried the door which was the closest. It was the logical thing to do, but it simply opened on a cleaning cupboard, a very untidy space that was being used as a dumping ground for anything the inn wanted to put out of sight. He shut the door again. It must be the other one then. He opened the other door, and it creaked loudly on its hinges. It led down another corridor, and it was sensible to assume it was the only way the young man could have gone, but for one thing. Harry hadn't heard that door creak. The boy couldn't have opened that door. Somehow he must have gone through the first one. Once more, Harry opened the cleaning cupboard door. Inside there were shelves lining the wall, and pegs from which hung a couple of cleaning aprons, an old duster, and a dustpan and brush combination that clipped together and hung from the handle of the brush. A vacuum cleaner, mop and bucket, a couple of brooms, 2 broken chairs, and an assortment of other stuff had been dumped in the cupboard, and were probably long forgotten about. It was hard to see if anything had recently been disturbed. It was all higgledy-piggledy anyway. Harry switched on the light, entered the cupboard, and softly shut the door behind him. He looked carefully around him as he had been taught. He made his way over and around items, slowly working his way to the back of the cupboard. There! Was that a freshly disturbed area at the back of the cupboard? It was a patch of dust that appeared to have recently been imprinted with a footprint. He bent over and examined it. Yes, definitely a footprint. But there was nothing else to see. Just the back of the cupboard, which was a plain brick wall, half hidden behind even more cluttered items. And yet the owner of the footprint had clearly stood looking at this very spot. And then Harry spied it. Another door. Chapter 7. The door at the back of the cupboard was small, narrow, and obscure. It was made of bricks, and it blended seamlessly into the surrounding brick wall. It was obviously intended to go unnoticed. There wasn't a handle that he could see, so Harry pushed hard on the door. It was just like pushing the brick wall. It didn't budge an inch. Dismayed, he reluctantly pushed a button at the side of his watch. "I've lost him," he hissed to Mrs Joyce. "I've found a door in the cleaning cupboard which he must have gone through, but it's locked." Back in his earpiece came Mrs Joyce's clear voice. "Hello? Oh, it's you, dear, is it? Yes, of course. Oh, that is nice. We must catch up soon. Yes, I'm staying put for now. I think that's wisest. I wouldn't want to miss my uncle visiting." Harry was used to Mrs Joyce's ways, and he knew she was pretending to take a phone call so that she could talk to him. The term uncle referred to officials, the police or other authorities. Harry wondered how old the people listening thought Mrs Joyce's uncle was, but Mrs Joyce didn't concern herself with things like that. "Oh, they'll just think I'm a silly old woman," she said to Harry when he tactfully suggested she ought to change it to brother or something else. "What's that, dear? You've bought a new mop, you say? Well, you never know how useful they can be. I once had a mop that lasted for 20 years, and then one day—" The strangely worded comments about the use and usefulness of mops, and lots of other related things, continued, and Harry focused on the tangled head of a dirty old mop which was leaning at the side of the subtle brick door, just in front of him. Because he was used to Mrs Joyce's ways, it quickly dawned on him that she must be able to see what he could see. That's why she was suddenly talking about mops. The front-facing strap of his new rucksack, the one Mrs Joyce had given him, must have a tiny concealed camera on it. Mrs Joyce could see where he was and what he was looking at. "Yes, a new bag can be such a handy thing too. So much better than the old one you had, I'm sure," Mrs Joyce interjected when Harry looked down at the rucksack. From Mrs Joyce's coded message, it was definitely the rucksack sending camera images to her. Harry could now see what Mrs Joyce had noticed behind the old mop. A glint of something metallic, which looked like— He quickly pulled at the mop, and it toppled flimsily to one side. Behind it was a shiny keypad. But Harry didn't have the code. Do you remember the Key to Life book which was mentioned at the start of the story? This book was an essential addition to Harry's work as a spy. In fact, it was crucial in the fight against evil forces. The Key to Life book wasn't about spying or enemy agents or anything like that. It was about what was right and good and true, and the truth was vitally important in defeating the wickedness and lies and deceit of enemies. The Key to Life book contained the codes that would show the right way, and Harry always carried it with him. Perhaps you've never been through a door like the hidden one that Harry now faced, or examined the kind of keypad that he now confronted. You see, although it looked like any other keypad, the code was special and required very particular knowledge of the Key to Life book. No enemy would have this information because they didn't believe in the book, but Harry knew the code would be found in it. He looked carefully at the door. It was almost hidden. Few would find it. It was small, obscure, and narrow. It was the start of the trail to find the strange young man who appeared to be linked to the plot he had overheard. It might be the start of the way to save his country. Harry removed the small black Key to Life book from the secure pouch on his belt and flicked through the pages, looking for a narrow way. He found the reference he was looking for and punched 130714 into the keypad. There was a soft, reassuring. Slowly, Harry opened the door. Chapter 8. Harry wasn't sure what to expect behind that hidden door. Steps underground, perhaps, or an ancient tunnel that people used to escape in olden days, or a dungeon, or even a dusty skeleton and old treasure chests. Whatever he was expecting, the worn carpet and faded walls of floral wallpaper were a decided letdown. It was as if he had walked into the entrance of an old person's house. Not Mrs Joyce's house, of course. She wasn't like that. But there was something odd about how normal and unthreatening it seemed. Harry paused. This felt like the wrong way. The young man wasn't in sight, and there was only one door through which he could have gone, which was straight ahead and directly opposite to the one Harry had come through, at the end of a very long passageway. Harry wondered how the older boy had worked out the door code if he was an enemy agent. Enemy agents didn't trust the Key to Life book, otherwise they wouldn't be enemies. Had he cracked it another way, or wasn't he an enemy after all? "Keep going straight ahead. I'm sure you can't get lost." Mrs Joyce's voice sang out on the earpiece, as if she was directing a person who was hard of hearing, who also had no sense of direction. "Yes, that's it, dear," she continued, as Harry started to walk down the corridor. The rucksack continued to send a video of his progress to Mrs Joyce, and Harry pictured her sat by the fire in the cosy inn, pretending to be a doddery old lady, and all the while helping to foil a sinister plot. Harry continued straight ahead, past dim antique pictures of flowers and landscapes on the wall. But the passageway seemed to grow longer and darker and less pleasant the further he went. Soon there were old mirrors on the wall instead of pictures, and his reflection in them was distorted. It showed him as dim and dirty, and then as grotesque and frightening too. He didn't want to continue, but at last he was nearing the door at the end, and he kept going until he reached it. It didn't occur to Harry that this door would be locked. Nothing seemed more unnecessary than securing a door which could only be discovered by entering through another locked door that was hidden away in a broom cupboard. Harry tried to ignore the horrible reflection of himself he could faintly see in the shiny surface of the door. If he looked too closely, he would be frightened to approach his own image. Instead, he focused on the keypad and the code he must find to unlock it. It was another key that was found in the Key to Life book. Once more he removed the small book from its secure pouch and thumbed through its pages. He had started through the narrow way with the first door. Now he had reached one which showed him at his very worst. But the Key to Life book had the answer to this too. Slowly he keyed 180323 into the keypad. The door clicked open. When this second door yielded, Harry felt he was at last truly entering an adventure, and, as often happens, he was no longer certain that he wanted to. This time steep steps plunged underground, leading to an ancient echoey tunnel. It was dark, and Harry removed his night scope from his spy belt and slipped it on. Everything had a strange reddish tinge, but at least he could see the way. Straight ahead, at the distant end of the passageway, there was another flight of steps, this time leading back up to ground level again. There was a large trap door at the top of this flight of steps. To Harry's relief, it wasn't locked, and when he pushed on it, it flopped back against a stone wall. Harry scrambled through the hatch, shut it behind him, and looked around. He had entered an old church. He was in a small lobby, the right-hand side of which was screened by large timber panelling with small chinks in it. He removed his night scope and put his spyglasses back on. That way he always had a small mirror through which he could see behind him. He peered through one of the small gaps in the timber panelling. He could see the rest of the church, which was dim and shadowy. A woman was cleaning with a duster, otherwise the big space appeared empty. It seemed to Harry that old churches were full of nooks and crannies, and the area in which he stood might once have been a small antechamber, perhaps where a priest or minister put on robes. On his left-hand side there was a small stained glass window set high in the stone wall, which he supposed was the outside wall of the church. A chair with a missing leg was tipped precariously in the corner, and the stone-flagged floor was dirty and neglected. Clearly the cleaning lady didn't come in here to clean. Apart from the door he had recently come through, there was only one exit from the space Harry had entered, another door, and this one required a key. Harry heard Mrs Joyce tut in frustration in his earpiece. Now what should they do? The door was old, solid timber, and the lock was one of those massive, old-fashioned pieces. It was far beyond Harry's capabilities to pick it or break it. "I dare say my uncle will arrive soon," Mrs Joyce was saying, pretending to be cheerful. She meant, of course, that the authorities might believe them and turn up and take over the search for the plot they were trying to discover, a plot which might cause disaster to their nation. With nothing left to lose, Harry pushed on the ancient door. To his astonishment, the door opened. It wasn't even locked. He heard Mrs Joyce's quick intake of breath, then she said, "Well, well, I dare say Uncle Andrew," she made up that name, of course, "won't mind if you go on. He is late after all." Harry stepped through the door. From the gloom beyond came a sudden movement. Harry went crashing to the floor. He had no time to operate any defensive device. He was knocked to the ground, his arm pinned tightly behind his back, and a voice suddenly said, "Gotcha!" It was the voice of the young man, the enemy agent. Harry was caught. Chapter 9. The young man twisted Harry's arm behind his back until it was very painful indeed. Harry was completely at his mercy. There was not a single move he could make to wriggle free and escape. What was the best plan to get out of this? Harry thought of Mrs Joyce and her tactics. Often Mrs Joyce pretended she was something else, that she was elderly and slow and dottled, when she was nothing of the kind. But because people saw what they expected to, the disguise worked every time. Harry thought it best that he, too, play dumb. He was a schoolboy. He might simply have lost his way. "Have you seen my nanny?" He gasped through the pain in his arm. "I need my nanny." He made his voice quaver, because he was much too brave for that to happen naturally, as if he was about to burst into tears. The young man hesitated for a fraction of a second, clearly surprised. "Your nanny?" "In the inn. Is this the way back to the inn?" The boy let go of Harry's arm and sat back on Harry's legs, pinning him in place. Harry wriggled, but he couldn't move. "I think you know very well that this isn't the way to the inn," the teenager said, and he sounded amused. "It would take some doing to get lost by passing through 2 doors with secret codes and into a high-security compound." Harry couldn't think what to say to that except, after a pause, "What are you going to do?" "That depends." The young man still seemed amused, and he removed himself from Harry's legs, allowing Harry to kneel on the floor. Harry turned to face him. "What does it depend on?" asked Harry warily. "It depends on whose side you're on, of course. You're pretty young to be a recruit, no matter whose side you're on, I must say, but perhaps desperate times call for unusual measures." Harry asked, Whose side are you on?" He was playing for time until he knew what to say and do. "The winning side, I hope," said the boy, "but that remains to be seen. Do you report to H?" Harry was aware of Mrs Joyce's intake of breath in his ear. He didn't know she was H, or what that might mean, but the name tag clearly meant something to Mrs Joyce. "I'm moving to the toilets," she muttered. "I can talk more freely there, and since I've drunk several cups of tea they won't be suspicious." "Why do you ask?" fenced Harry. "I was told H might be in the vicinity," said the boy. "I'm not officially on the payroll, at least not yet, but I discovered the plot through a homemade device, and well, here I am. Of course, if you're not with H, I won't be able to release you, I'm afraid. Not until it's all over." "Ask him why mice eat cheese," said Mrs Joyce in his earpiece. This was straight from a spy novel. Harry had always wanted to ask a coded question, even though he didn't know the answer. Harry asked the question. "Because they're not squirrels," the young man replied promptly, which seemed to satisfy Mrs Joyce, even though Harry thought it wasn't a very good spy question and answer at all. "Tell him you're with H," said Mrs Joyce's voice in his ear. "It looks like we've got an ally." When Harry explained that he was indeed with H, the young man beamed. He quickly introduced himself as Davy and explained he was an inventor who developed technology for the Secret Service agencies of the UK. He looked too young to be an inventor working for MI5 or MI6, and then he reluctantly admitted that he hadn't actually had any invention accepted by any official organisation. He still attended the local College of Computing Science and Technology, but he hoped that one day soon his groundbreaking designs would be recognised for their true worth. On Mrs Joyce's instructions, Harry gave Davy the spare earpiece that he found in the rucksack she had provided. Now the three of them were linked together. "What was your invention that you found out the plot with?" Harry asked Davy, as they dusted themselves down and prepared to continue exploring together. Well, I suppose you could say I'm quite good with computers," said Davy modestly. "I can, get into other computers and figure out what's going on, you see?" "He's a hacker," said Mrs Joyce. "He's one of the best there is. That's how I've seen his photo. But never mind that. You must hurry." It transpired that Davy had no more idea than Harry what lay ahead. Once Davy had learned of the plot by hacking a foreign computer system, he, too, had tried to alert the authorities. But since Davy was often in touch with them about this invention or that, or this conspiracy or that, they didn't believe him. "So I came myself," he said, "started looking for a hidden door, then found the secret door in the cupboard close to the toilets. I figured out the codes the way you did." "Do you use the Key to Life book, then?" asked Harry. "Of course. You can't come the right way through the doors with any other book. Anyway, I found the key to the old door where I ambushed you, which saved you finding it, and, well, here we are." Here was no longer in the church. They had followed the hidden passageway down the false side of the church, at the end of which were stone-flagged steps that led steeply downwards. They were once more underground, in an ancient tunnel that was leading away from the church, and further away from the inn. Chapter 10. It was cold and dark in the tunnel. Harry was going to use his night scope again, but Davy's watch, which was the latest in smart technology, also functioned as a very bright light. Davy lit the way. "We're heading northeast," he said, checking his watch's GPS. He tapped into Google Maps on his watch and found a map of the village of Little London. He zoomed in on the outlying buildings which formed the Little London Business Park. They could see All Hallows by the Loddon Church on the map, and the Crooked Man Inn. Their current location in the tunnel wasn't shown on the map, but they didn't expect that. It was probably secret, and not marked on any modern document at all. Harry saw there were plenty of tracks snaking through the trees around the business park, and he remembered the entrance driveway which he and Mrs Joyce had passed not long before. The man driving the big 4x4, who had sped through the entrance to the business park, was he part of whatever nefarious plan was unfolding here? Nothing looked sinister about the map. It all seemed very mundane. There were a few local businesses, including a florist called Secret Garden Flowers, marked on the map. There were 2 empty units, and there was one larger detached unit labelled Nature Care Control and Conservation Centre. Harry said, "I thought that's where we needed to go, because it's NCCCC. What we're looking for is the National Cyber Control Coordination Centre," said Davy. "That's the information I discovered. But it's curious that it's got the same initials as the nature conservation place, and I wonder—" "It's much too curious to be a coincidence," interrupted Mrs Joyce. "I wonder if all these businesses, or at least the nature one, are a cover for highly secret government premises," said Davy. "Never mind your theories," retorted Mrs Joyce. "For now it's enough to know that you're on the right track." "Yes, H," said Davy. "She's a legend," he murmured to Harry. "I can't believe I'm working for her at last." "Less about me and focus on the mission," said Mrs Joyce crisply. "This next part is going to be vitally important, but it might get tricky." They were once more at a door, a metal door, big and solid and secure. It seemed devoid of any sign or mark whatsoever. Mrs Joyce could see it through the camera which was still beaming images from Harry's rucksack. "Any keypad?" "No, ma'am," said Davy. "It looks like some kind of security door." "Any lock or other detail?" "Not that I can see," said Davy gloomily. "What do you think, Harry?" "I think—" Harry was peering closely at the door. It appeared to be marked and buckled slightly at the edge, as if it had been interfered with. He pushed the door. He hadn't done so with any intention, and was as surprised as the others when the door simply opened, although he pretended not to be. "Smart boy," praised Mrs Joyce. "Invaluable." Davy exclaimed, "Someone's broken in." Harry's triumph of usefulness died away as he and Davy went through the broken door and stopped in horror. Harry gasped, "Is that—" Davy nodded grimly. It was a bomb. Chapter 11. "Now is not the time to panic." Mrs Joyce's voice cut through the horrified silence. Harry suddenly remembered Mum saying to Mrs Joyce, "I know he's always safe with you." It was just as well she couldn't see him now. When the first heart-stopping moment passed, Harry and Davy approached the bomb cautiously. It wasn't your typical bomb, not that Harry knew what a real bomb looked like except what he'd seen in photos. But Davy, who seemed to know something about everything, was more intrigued than afraid. It was a huge cylindrical contraption, at the top of which was a ginormous tube that went straight up through the ceiling to somewhere they couldn't see. The old tunnel had been expanded to create a circular chamber around the device. A crudely dug channel had blasted through to this circular chamber, evidence of how the thing had been put there. The bomb was fastened to a massive pipe which came through the middle of the newly blasted passage. There was a strange rushing, gurgling noise in that pipe that puzzled the boys. "It almost sounds like water," said Davy. "But that wouldn't be very harmful, would it?" Water didn't sound particularly drastic to Harry, who had imagined all kinds of fiery explosives, but not water. "It probably is water," said Mrs Joyce, as always knowing far more about what was going on than anyone else. "Is there a timer on it? Any way of stopping it?" There was no timer that the boys could see, no indication that it was counting down to blast off. There was simply a faint, contented, gurgling hum, as if the machine was on standby and awaiting a command. After a brief discussion, it was decided that the two boys should continue past the bomb — there was just enough space to squeeze around the contraption — to explore whatever lay ahead. The camera on Harry's rucksack captured an image of the bomb-like device, and Mrs Joyce quickly sent it to the Encores. She hoped they would take the photo seriously and rush to Little London to take charge. Mrs Joyce instructed, "Leave a remote control camera. Then I can watch what's happening at the device while you go and see what's ahead." Davy looked blank, and Harry was about to explain that they didn't have one of Mrs Joyce's marvellous remote control cameras, when he remembered he was carrying a rucksack, the contents of which were completely unknown to him, but not unknown to Mrs Joyce. He swung the rucksack off and poked around inside it, marvelling at the variety of things that seemed to be there. His hand closed on a small round object, and, sure enough, he pulled out a camera very similar to the one Mrs Joyce had deployed earlier, except that now he could see it in detail. It did indeed look like a small stone. No wonder it was almost invisible on the road. Mrs Joyce sounded as hurried as she ever did. "Just drop it," she said. "I can do the rest from here." Harry dropped it, and it rolled, as you would expect, but then it seemed to take on a life of its own. As they watched, it stuck out little arms, and small stands, like legs, shot out from underneath. It waddled across the passage and began to climb the wall. Even Davy, with all his knowledge of gadgets, could hardly believe his eyes. "Hurry now," said Mrs Joyce. Harry could imagine her holding the controls of the remote control camera, operating it from the ladies' toilets in the Crooked Man Inn. Davy set off, and Harry followed him down another short passageway to another doorway. At the side of the door was an escape ladder leading up the wall to a small hatch in the roof of the tunnel. Blocking the doorway was a thick, solid metal door with huge bolts that were intended to make this place very secure indeed. But, ominously, the security door was open. The bolts were broken. The CCTV cameras that were on either side of the door were smashed. Hardly daring to breathe, they walked through the doorway and into the most massive computer room they could ever have imagined. Harry heard Mrs Joyce mutter in his ear, "Just as I thought." She sounded grim and unsurprised, as if she had now pieced together a picture of what might be afoot in this strange plot. Davy was entranced. They were in a mainframe data processing room, which stored electronic systems and computerized information of great importance. There was row after row of tall cabinets with see-through fronts, with each cabinet containing thousands upon thousands of tiny metallic components, with wires snaking this way and that, and buttons and switches and controls of great complexity. Lights were flickering across the countless microchips, and over the whole space there was a quiet, computer-like hum. Nothing was happening. There were faint background noises which didn't sound too suspicious. Footsteps, doors opening and closing, perhaps a car being driven away. All the types of sounds you might expect as people finished work for the day and went home. Then even those sounds died away. Harry was conscious of the time. He had noticed a digital display in the vast computer room, and the time was 16:49. It was almost the 16:50 deadline. Suddenly, Mrs. Joyce was saying, "Back to the bomb! Quickly, boys, you must stop it!" They didn't know what she meant until they retraced their steps through the broken security door, down the passageway to the massive contraption. A man was there. He had opened a hidden control hatch and was busy twiddling knobs and flicking switches, and from the machine began a throaty growl. He looked utterly astonished on seeing Davy, but he didn't miss a movement, and faster than ever he began to press keys on the small tablet linked by a wire into the open hatch on the device. "Stop him!" cried Mrs. Joyce. Davy took a flying leap, much as he had at Harry earlier, and grabbed the man by the ankles, tumbling to the ground with him. Harry rushed up behind him. The man yelled. The machine gave a massive whoosh and exploded. Chapter 12. The noise was tremendous. It was like being caught in the engine of an aeroplane, or the inner workings of a mighty machine. Harry couldn't hear what the man was shouting, or even whether he was speaking English. Nothing could be heard but the bomb working, doing something through the massive pipe. It was not so much like one enormous explosion as an ongoing volcano. Harry couldn't hear Mrs. Joyce either, and certainly couldn't see the small remote control camera that had been there not long before. Feeling nauseated with the dreadful thumping noise, he wanted nothing more than to get as far away from it as possible. But where was Davy? Then Harry felt sick with dread, even more than with the awful thumping noise. Davy was being held in a headlock by a very angry man, who was shaking him and shouting, and looked likely to kill him at any moment. Thankfully, he didn't do that. Instead, he dragged Davy up the corridor, back to the computer room. The man seemed to have forgotten about Harry, and that, at least, was an advantage. The man and Davy reached the broken security door leading to the mainframe room. At the last minute, just before he vanished from sight, Davy made a gesture to the metal steps etched into the wall at the computer room doorway. They offered a way of escape if Harry could get through the secure hatch above. For a second, Davy's eyes met Harry's. Harry nodded. Davy disappeared from sight into the computer room, and as quickly as possible, Harry went up the ladder. It was too much to hope that the hatch in the ceiling would simply open by shoving it. This was, after all, a highly secure area. There was another keypad set into the lid itself. Harry had little time to think, but he knew the next key-to-life code off by heart. He tapped 10-10-09 into the keypad, and immediately there was a soft, reassuring sound. He pushed as hard as possible on the hatch. Surprisingly, he found that it opened easily into the above-ground world, to be accurate, into a storage shed. Harry shrugged off his rucksack and shoved that through the small opening first. Then he climbed through and scrambled to his feet. He immediately shut the hatch behind him. With foresight Mrs. Joyce would have been proud of, he pushed a wheelbarrow on top of the hatch to stop anyone following. Then he took stock. It was cold. The wind was howling around the shed in which he stood. A storm must have started while he had been exploring underground. There didn't appear to be much of interest in the store. If anything, the miscellaneous tools and equipment showed it was merely a dumping ground for whatever company maintained the grounds and buildings of the business park. He opened the shed door, and stared and stared and stared in amazement. The world had completely changed. Chapter 13. A blinding blizzard of ginormous snowflakes raged outside. That would have been incredible enough, since there had been no sign of snow earlier, and certainly none was forecast, which Harry knew because he was always checking. But what was more surprising was that this was no normal winter storm. The snow came from underground. Massive quantities of snowflakes were being spewed into the air. They were blown so furiously and high that when they fell to earth again, they landed all around the business park, and across Little London too, although Harry couldn't see that far at that moment. The bomb, or whatever the explosive device was certainly doing its work. But what a strange joke it was to go to all that trouble to cause a winter snowstorm. But what a storm! There was so much snow that already it was accumulating on the ground. Harry took in the fantastical winter scene that had transformed the quiet village of Little London. Any other time he would have been delighted at a fall of snow in December, even if it wasn't quite Christmas. However, right now he needed to fetch help, if only to find and rescue Davy from whoever the angry man was who had set the snow machine in motion. But he could hardly even see the way through this storm, and probably most of the people who worked around here had already gone home. What to do? On the floor at his feet, something had rolled out of his rucksack. He bent down and poked at it. He recalled Mrs Joyce giving him the rucksack she had provided and saying, "It's got all you need, even for Arctic conditions," as if she knew quite well what he would need. After all, this whole plot, or whatever it was called Operation Snow. Harry picked up the item and shook out red overalls. There was a label that said, "Camouflage suit, Arctic conditions." Harry didn't know how the suit could possibly provide camouflage when it was red, but he was very glad it seemed to be for Arctic conditions. He pulled the suit over his clothes, stopping to remove his spy belt and fit it around the overalls. The legs of the suit were a little long, but it was a pretty good fit, and he zipped it up. It was the most marvellously soft and warm material. Feather light, not thick and bulky like a normal snowsuit, but thin and silky smooth. Harry had never worn anything like it before, but one thing for sure, he wasn't cold anymore, and he didn't think he ever would be wearing this suit. Next, Harry removed a large, flat item from the rucksack. There wasn't much to show what it was, only a label on the top which said, "Pull here to inflate." Harry pulled the tag. There was a startling, not like the dreadful racket made by the snow machine, but a swift and sudden intake of high-pressure air that animated the flat packet in the most extraordinary way. The lifeless rubber began to distort and extend and take on a life of its own. From the package emerged the shape of a quad bike? No, it was not quite that. It had runners and Harry was staring at the most incredible blow-up snowmobile. The final part which took shape was a simple dashboard that popped out from inside of the machine. It had a start button, a stop button, and not much in between. There was no speedometer, just a sliding lever that had 4 settings: still, slow, medium, and high. There was a small label that said, "Battery life 1 hour," with some smaller writing that Harry didn't bother to read. 1 hour didn't seem too much time, but it would hopefully be sufficient to get back to the Crooked Man Inn, which was, after all, only a short distance away, and find Mrs Joyce. The ear extension seemed to have died when the bomb went off. Harry took off his rear-view spyglasses, which would only get covered in snow, straddled the seat of the snowmobile, pressed "Start," and shot through the door of the shed into the snow. With hindsight, he realized he should have checked the speed lever was set to still or slow rather than high, and perhaps got used to the snowmobile before charging into the storm. But he gamely hung on as the machine flew at breakneck speed over the snow, which was growing deeper every moment. It was hard to tell in the raging blizzard exactly how much snow was falling, but it seemed to Harry that the amount of snow coming from the huge underground funnel had increased significantly even from the first time he had seen it only moments before. Masses and masses and millions and billions of snowflakes were spilling wildly from the underground opening high into the air. And were there other outlets of snow also starting? Harry had no time to see more. He had to concentrate on holding onto the machine, which was going very fast indeed. He had no sense of which direction he was travelling. It was by chance that he took a path between two of the business units and crashed through a gateway onto a forest track. The snowmobile leapt over heaps of snow and plunged through drifts, and when it left the track altogether, Harry negotiated around trees as best he could and somehow managed to miss them all. He plunged through a couple of bushes. They tore at his snowsuit, which proved impervious even to the jagged thorns of gorse. The high-tech suit had turned white and blended with his surroundings. Harry and the snowmobile were camouflaged against the snow. A startled pheasant rose with a screech from the shelter of the snowy undergrowth, and a rabbit ran in terror from the plunging machine. He even caught a glimpse of a deer, who was staring in amazement at the strange, almost silent contraption which appeared from nowhere and was like nothing it had ever seen before. Harry steered the snowmobile as best he could in the direction that he thought led back to the village and the Crooked Man Inn. It was hard to tell where this was now, as the track had snaked in various directions, and Harry hadn't known which way he was going since he left it. He had been too busy trying to avoid trees. He hadn't yet managed to get his hands on the sliding lever to slow the machine, so full speed ahead he plunged. There was no sight of the business units or of the houses of Little London, but when the trees thinned, through the blinding snow, he thought he could dimly see the shapes of the buildings he had left behind. Adjacent to the buildings was a church spire, which must belong to the church he came through, that linked to the inn by the underground tunnel. He couldn't see the inn at all, but with the faint sight of the tall steeple, at least he had something to indicate the direction in which he must go to find Mrs. Joyce, if only he could slow the machine and get back onto the forest track. With determined effort, he fumbled with freezing fingers, which didn't benefit from the wonderful warmth of the snowsuit he was wearing, and grasped the lever. But instead of moving the lever to slow, he hit the stop button instead. From flying at top speed across the snow, the snowmobile gave a shuddering gasp and stopped dead on the track. Harry was catapulted over the handlebars into the middle of a snowdrift. He lay there dazed for a moment. Then he heard a shout. He was about to be caught. Chapter 14. Still feeling distinctly winded, Harry got to his feet and scrambled as fast as he could to the snowmobile. He had to fetch help, not get caught by whoever was instigating whatever strange plot was afoot. "Harry, wait!" Harry stopped in astonishment. How could it be? But it was. Mrs. Joyce was speeding through the snow towards him on a superb snowmobile. "Well done, Harry," she said as she reached him. Harry was glad they didn't need pleasantries and small talk and fuss. He was a little bit embarrassed he had fallen off the snowmobile, but Mrs. Joyce didn't mention it at all. "Good work," she said. "I thought it might be tricky to arrange where to meet when the snow bomb interrupted the signal, but I put a tracking device on the rucksack I gave you, and on the snowmobile, of course, and I knew I could rely on you to choose a safe rendezvous." Harry didn't know what to say to that. He might have known Mrs. Joyce had a way of finding him. Mrs. Joyce, who was wearing a snowsuit similar to Harry's, had stopped her snowmobile and got off it to examine Harry's. "I think we'll share my snowmobile from here. Yours has very little battery left. It only goes an hour on slow speed, and for far less time on high. Such a nuisance that we haven't yet perfected a long-life disposable snowmobile, but perhaps Davy can work on that. Now." "Davy is captured," said Harry gloomily. "Yes, of course," said Mrs. Joyce, as if she was agreeing about the weather or something equally mundane. "Good kid that, very brave, and very astute too. If anyone can stop the sabotage, it's young computer whiz Davy." "Right," said Harry. "On you hop," said Mrs. Joyce. "We must get back to the business park to reconnoitre a bit, and hopefully help Davy, and then, just in time to miss the action, no doubt, the Oncles might turn up to clear up after us." "Right," said Harry again, and got on the back of Mrs. Joyce's snowmobile. Unlike Harry, it was clear that Mrs. Joyce had driven a snowmobile before. At least, so Harry assumed, because she was expert at handling it, far better than she was driving her funny old car. Mrs. Joyce did what Harry had planned to do if he had gained control of his snowmobile. She quickly found and joined the snowy track. At least, it seemed to Harry that she had, but the snow was now so deep and blinding that nothing was very clear any more. They plunged through the forest, snaking between trees and around bushes, far faster than felt, or was, remotely safe. Mrs. Joyce seemed to know which direction to take, veering confidently down forks in the path whenever they appeared through the thick, flying snow. It felt like they were going around in circles. No business park appeared. The encouraging church spire was no longer in sight. They no longer had any hope of spotting any sign of life. Everything was disguised by the ferocious blizzard. It blotted out the whole world. What was it all about? Mrs. Joyce must know, Harry thought. But was it all so bad after all? He had hardly had time to make sense of what had occurred, and thinking about it, holding on to Mrs. Joyce and flying through the snow, it didn't make any sense anyway. Perhaps it wasn't sinister or wrong at all. Maybe this was merely a factory designed to make snow for Christmas, a fantastic experiment gone wrong. After all, what terrorists made bombs of snow? Chapter 15. The snow was rapidly getting deeper. There was no let-up in the blizzard. And then the trees thinned, then stopped altogether. Suddenly the business park was straight ahead. There were even more funnels of snow shooting into the sky from other buildings in the compound. The 2 vacant units were churning out snow like they really were snow factories. The snowmobile rapidly reached the boundary fence of the business park. There was no need to find a gate, and Mrs. Joyce certainly had no intention of stopping to open one. She steered for the biggest snowdrift, and over they went, leaving the ground entirely at the top, dropping with a stomach-churning plunge, and landing in the snow on the other side. No one was in sight. There was hardly a murmur from the snowmobile, which was almost silent. There was just the howl of the ferocious storm that was still increasing. Mrs. Joyce was taking no chances of being seen. She drove the snowmobile around the back of the deserted secret garden flowers unit, straight under the cover of a large open lean-to, as if she knew precisely where she was going. She pulled the speed lever down through medium to slow, and then finally to still. Then she pressed stop. They both climbed off the snowmobile. They were surrounded by the paraphernalia of a flower business preparing for Christmas. There were boxes of Christmas wreaths, a large crate of freshly cut holly and fir, containers of baubles, feathers, and small glittering ornaments, strands of tinsel and Christmassy ribbons, a station where someone had been spraying gold and silver metallic spray on pine cones and teasels. All was in readiness for a busy Christmas season. Have you ever been bursting with questions but afraid to ask them because everyone else seems to know the answers? Harry didn't often ask questions, especially since Mrs Joyce always supposed he knew the answer. But he really wanted to know why this incredible deluge of snow was such a bad thing, and how it related to whatever criminal plan was being hatched in a computer room somewhere below the ground. He asked, "But why have they made snow?" Mrs Joyce seemed very interested in what was stored in the shelter. She began to rummage through the Christmassy supplies by which they were surrounded. "What's that, Harry? How did they make the snow? Oh, that's not so tricky, although I grant you I'm impressed with the size of the snow bombs they managed to install underground, under the noses of the government. I've spotted 5 causing chaos already, and they've clearly taken advantage of the empty units which were meant for, well, never mind what. But a snow bomb is really a fairly simple contraption. Generally, it links to a high-pressure water supply and basically takes in enormous amounts of water at an extremely high speed, cools it into tiny ice crystals which stick together to form snowflakes, rather big unwieldy ones as we've witnessed. Of course, the temperature and moisture have to be exactly right, but the end result is that massive quantities of snow are spewed out of the machine at high speed, which gives the blizzard effect. They use similar devices in ski resorts when there isn't enough snow. No, they're not in the teasels box. Perhaps I should have started with something less prickly. Harry had no notion what Mrs Joyce was searching for in the teasels box. He was still trying to work out why snow had been used in this strange plot. But why snow? Harry tried again. I suppose you mean why snow more than any other type of extreme weather, mused Mrs Joyce, as always taking it for granted that Harry knew much more than he sometimes did. After all, what one thing brings the country to a halt and affects the economy more than just about anything else? Snow? Ventured Harry, thinking this must be the answer, even if he wasn't sure why. Exactly. Or to be more precise, extreme weather of any kind, which of course you know. We can deal with terrorist threats and bombs and, usually, with cyber warfare, but this combination of crippling snowstorms and blizzards, which are controlled by our enemies and could last for days, coupled with a concerted cyber takeover of our most important computers, this could bring our country to disaster. It has the potential to change the nation we know and send us back to the Dark Ages, or at the very least leave us at the mercy of evil powers to dictate to us as they please or demand massive sums of money as a ransom. We should have been more prepared for a climate war, every bit as much as a cyber one. Harry got the picture, sort of. If not the exact detail, then enough information to realize how dangerous the controlled snowstorm, coupled with the takeover of the country's most important computer mainframe, could be. He suddenly realized that whoever controlled computers controlled everything, from satellites in space to defense missiles, banking, passports, tax, communication, transportation, education, the internet. All the things a modern country relied on as a civilized nation was bound up in tiny computer chips. Anything and everything that was of the least importance was recorded on databases. It's really very simple, isn't it? Said Mrs Joyce. There's nothing can stop the British like the weather. In fact, It's so simple an idea that I don't suppose the authorities can believe it, although they must, at least, believe the evidence of their own eyes in London. Harry wondered if she meant Little London, not the big city of London. Is that why they chose here? He asked. Because the most important computer systems are hidden away in Little London. Mrs. Joyce nodded. But it's not just here, she said. At the most important computer, defence and government administration sites in the country, they've released snow bombs, including in the big city of London. Soon they'll take control of our systems, but over days and weeks, if they snow us out of our own facilities, they can change, dismantle, and even destroy our entire way of life. Somewhere there is a master switch which controls it all, and I think it's hidden away here. The Encores, Harry began, are they coming to help? He realized that unless these government authorities had special equipment, soon they wouldn't be able to get through the snow at all. Not even a helicopter could fly in this snow. Mrs. Joyce looked serious as she said, I think, Harry, that for now, stopping this disaster is up to us. Chapter 16. Although they were on a vital mission to save their country, Mrs. Joyce continued to search among the stores of flower-focused materials in the sheltered secret garden flowers lean-to. She borrowed some wire, then she rummaged in a box of gold-sprayed pine cones, scrutinizing each one carefully until she found one that she liked, which, oddly enough, was a silver one which had got into the wrong box. She threaded the borrowed wire into the cone. After this, she removed an ear extension device from her own rucksack and joined it to the wire snaking into the pine cone. Then she held up her work to the dim overhead light, at last seeming satisfied with her pine cone cum ear extension invention. Do you think this will do the trick? She asked Harry. Harry wasn't at all sure what trick the strange invention was intended to perform. He shrugged. I'm not so sure about it either, Mrs. Joyce confessed, but we'll give it a try and see how we go. Otherwise you'll have to work out an alternative for us. Harry once again wished that Mrs. Joyce was a little bit clearer about what was going on, and more specifically, for what purpose she needed the pine cone. He didn't let on how surprised he was when she held it close to her mouth and spoke into it. Davy? Come in, Davy. H. calling Davy. And how astonished he was when from the hard bristles of the pine cone, Davy's voice returned, Davy to H. Davy to H. Assistance needed to... and so on. Was that a normal pine cone? Harry asked when Davy's message ended. Mrs. Joyce looked surprised that Harry had asked that question. Then her face cleared. Oh, you think they must keep all their Secret Service supplies locked away, she exclaimed. But there are always some available, and I particularly asked them to leave supplies in the lean-to in case we needed any. I've worked with secret garden flowers for years, so they know me, you see. A very reliable espionage service, as you would expect. She winked at Harry and smiled a funny, significant kind of smile, as if Harry knew perfectly well what she was talking about. Mrs. Joyce gave Harry his own pine cone ear extension. She explained that it was a different frequency to the previous ear extension system, which no longer worked. The enemy agents who controlled the snow bombs and were currently hacking the country's important computer systems had also jumbled sound signals to interrupt communication too. But that was nothing to Mrs. Joyce's powers of invention. Mrs. Joyce took extra supplies from the flower store, then consulted a detailed plan of the business park. They checked their equipment, and then they climbed on board the snowmobile, and, with Mrs. Joyce at the controls, they plunged back into a world of snow. It was strange snow. It was unusual for Little London, of course, which hadn't ever had snow like this. But there was something about the size of the flakes, too. Massive, heavy, splattering flakes that heaped up so rapidly that it was already impossible to say how many inches covered the ground. The darkness of a winter's evening now shrouded their surroundings. They hadn't got far to go. Nowhere was far within the boundary of the business park. Mrs. Joyce drove carefully across the banks and heaps of snow which disguised their surroundings. Nothing looked the same. Buildings were blurred and barely visible in the blizzard. Signs were obscured. Roads and parking areas were indistinguishable. In fact, they wouldn't have known which way to turn to find Davy had it not been for the earpieces they were both wearing and Davy's voice directing them. They drove around every building looking for anything which might indicate the small, barred window that Davy had described. He could see snow falling from the storeroom he was locked in. He was now watching for them. When they were closer to Davy's location, Mrs. Joyce flicked on the snowmobile's lights for Davy to find them from his window. At last, an excited voice in their earpieces. "I think I see your lights. To the right. No, my right, your left. You're almost looking at me. You see the window now?" It was hard to see anything at all. Following Davy's instructions, they stopped at a tiny, obscured, barred opening which indicated a window. Harry was dismayed. The snow had piled up too high too quickly. There was hardly room to get Davy out, even assuming they could remove the bars. "We'll never get him out," he exclaimed. "Get him out?" returned Mrs. Joyce. "We're not getting him out. We're going in." Chapter 17. The plan to enter enemy territory and join Davy was not, in Harry's opinion, any easier than rescuing Davy and escaping back to the inn to wait for help. Of course, he didn't dispute it. He watched as Mrs. Joyce first removed the bars with a cutting device on the back of the fantastic snowmobile, and then cut a neat, smooth hole in the glass window pane with a glass-cutting instrument she had in her ever-surprising rucksack. Still, Harry wondered why they didn't simply pull Davy through the hole in the window, rather than the two of them giving up the comparative advantage of their snowmobile and entering a locked storeroom, where they would most definitely be trapped and possibly found. Mrs. Joyce didn't hesitate. She plunged through the hole in the window, and Harry quickly followed. They both stumbled and tumbled from the high window down into the small, mostly underground storeroom, helped by Davy, who was very pleased to see them, and not at all surprised at Mrs. Joyce's plan. Davy helped Mrs. Joyce carefully fit the cut piece of glass back into the hole in the window to stop the snow flying through. It would have fitted perfectly, but they left a small gap, through which Mrs. Joyce threaded what looked like a length of hosepipe from her rucksack. Then she stuck the whole thing in place with sticky, Christmassy ribbon from the flower store. Thankfully, they didn't have to be careful about the noise they made. The biggest snow bomb, the one that Harry and Davy had seen, still thumped and vibrated and monopolized sound so completely that the noise of their movements was disguised. They took stock of their surroundings. It didn't take long, since they were in a small, cluttered storeroom, which was little more than a large, jumbled cupboard. "I thought you would find me," said Davy. "I realized that the 4MB ATB longwave signal was interrupted, and knew you would find a way of hooking up to the HZM1 transmission. They won't be able to interfere with that." Harry didn't know what 4MB ATB and HZM1 stood for, but it seemed that Mrs. Joyce had not only located Davy, she had also found a new way to communicate, which the enemy spies had no idea about. Whatever HZM1 was, it definitely worked. "I've been watching them. Davy continued eagerly, and Harry noticed a stack of boxes piled on top of each other almost to the ceiling of the room. At the top, by the air vent, there was a small space with horizontal slats, a few of which had been removed. Davy grinned. "I can't hear what they're saying, but I can see a bit of what they're up to." "Good lad," said Mrs Joyce. She scrambled up the boxes. "I can see the master switch. I just knew it would be here," said Mrs Joyce from the top of the boxes. "But at least they don't know the save code for the master switch. If they had that, it would all be over. Whoever has that information will win the day, if only they can use it in time." When she rejoined them, Mrs Joyce removed from her rucksack some of the additional supplies she had borrowed from the flower store. With Davy's assistance, she began wiring another pine cone come something else together. She left a trailing wire coming from the sprayed pine cone, this time a gold one, and then wired that into the end of the USB port attached to her smartphone. Incredibly, a mechanical voice came from the phone. "Phase 3 is complete. 10 minutes and counting." Is that—" Harry began. "It's them all right," said Mrs Joyce. "They're speaking Cacobangian, but I hooked them up to my Google Translate. We can hear everything they say on their communication system now." "Awesome," said Davy. Mrs Joyce nodded, but she looked grim. "We have 10 minutes before they override the master switch. After that, we can't take back control without knowing their own encryption codes, and even then it might be too late. They'll simply move the data to another location, and in the meantime, they've got control of our country. Do you think we can do it, Davy? Can you get to the switch and input the correct save code before they've blocked it? If we can do that, we've got back control, and there's nothing more they can do." Davy nodded. "I think so," he said. "I've seen the master switch. It's tricky to reach, and you need the save code to get into the secure case it's in, but I think I can make it." He set his smartwatch with the remaining time they had to stop the computer hackers. It began counting down the final 10 minutes. "How are we going to get Davy into the computer room?" asked Harry. He was examining the door, wondering if there was yet another code they should try to open it. But there was no code and no obvious way of opening the lock, and Davy explained that his captors had also barred the door on the other side. Harry envisaged Mrs Joyce cutting a big hole in the door, the way she had through the window. But instead, Mrs Joyce said, "We must get them to open it. Davy, put on this snowsuit or you're about to get very cold. Now, let's give them a taste of their own invention." From the rucksack, Mrs Joyce removed a bomb. Chapter 18. The device that Mrs Joyce removed from the rucksack was her own version of a snow bomb. With the clock counting down the 10 precious minutes they had to stop the computer hackers, there was no time to spare. With 8 minutes remaining until the enemy agents took control of the all-important master switch, Mrs Joyce linked her own bomb to the hose she had threaded through the window, climbed the pile of boxes Davy had made, positioned the snow bomb at the air vent, and immediately detonated the device. A whirring, swishing, vibrating noise began, drowned by the sound of the far bigger snow bomb, which was still pounding away and helping to conceal their presence. Mrs Joyce ordered, "Take cover!" She scrambled back down the boxes and crouched beside the boys, behind tall shelves that were full of office stationery. It was wonderful watching the miniature snow bomb spewing snow straight through the air vent into the room beyond. A little of it escaped and made small, pretty drifts around the boxes, but most went straight where it was intended, into the computer mainframe room. Mrs Joyce's device wasn't making snow in the same way as the enormous machine they had seen earlier. Hers was greedily sucking it from outside through the length of pipe, and the small snow bomb was then feeding the snow at high speed through the air vent to the workers and computers in the main room. It was certainly giving them a taste of their own invention. It wasn't long before it was noticed. The gang at work in the mainframe computer room began to get annoyed. First, they accused each other, thinking someone had left a door or window open. And then they thought of the boy they had locked away in the large storage cupboard, where the snow appeared to be entering. Inside the storeroom, the three good spies could hear everything that was said. The smartphone translated the exclamations, and they gathered it was assumed that Davy had somehow escaped through the window and that the snow was now penetrating the building and in danger of affecting the computers in the room. They weren't so concerned at the fact that Davy had escaped. They didn't think he would get far in the storm, and they had nearly achieved their mission anyway. But they were worried about the precious computers they so badly wanted to control. One man was dispatched to investigate the storeroom. The three crouched in the shadows, tensed as he approached. "Get your spy gear ready, Harry," said Mrs Joyce quietly. "Davy, you know what you must do. We'll provide whatever distraction we can." The small storeroom had grown very cold between the outside storm and the new snow bomb. The three conspirators were extremely glad for their high-tech snowsuits. There was the sound of bolts being drawn, of a key turning in the lock. "Get ready," whispered Mrs Joyce. The door swung open. "Now!" Chapter 19. Quick as a flash, Davy sprang for the door and was around the man and out into the computer room before anyone had a chance to stop him. He had made good use of his time in the store and knew exactly which route to take to the all-important master switch. If this wasn't such a terrible crisis, the commotion in the large room would have been very funny. Inside the secure underground space, where there should only have been computers quietly churning, there was snow falling and dancing and swirling and landing here, there, and everywhere. Large snowflakes were being blown about in every direction, teasing and tormenting the people working there, who were now in complete disarray. The folk inside the computer room, 3 men and 3 women, weren't armed guards or frightening terrorists. They were there because they were computer experts, and they looked like they worked in an office and were doing a normal day's work. They certainly weren't dressed for a snowstorm. The armed guards were now bursting through the door, in answer to the shouts of their colleagues. They didn't stop to seize Davy. Instead they rushed for the storeroom, following the pointing and yelling of the rest of the gang. Davy didn't have time to worry about Mrs Joyce and Harry. He headed straight for the master switch that could stop this whole plan dead in its tracks. If he could input the save code for the master switch, the computer data would be safe, and the enemy agents would immediately be stopped from causing further harm. The master switch was located at the top of a large casement housing millions of complicated computer components. The switch was inside its own separate case, a bulletproof see-through container, secure and unbreakable, only accessible through the keypad beside it. Davy knew this. He had seen it when he studied the room through the air vent. He grabbed a chair and wheeled it through the snow that was drifting in pretty heaps on the floor. The snow tugged at the chair's wheels and tried to pull it in the wrong direction. A woman in a red jacket noticed what he was doing and skidded through the snow to get to him. She was yelling at him in Cacobanjoian. She had realized Davy was attempting to get to the master switch to stop their efforts to take over the country's computer systems. Davy reached the cabinet and shoved the unwieldy chair against it. Then he jumped wildly, trying to reach for the top of the casement. His fingers plunged into the snow, then slid off, and he tumbled onto the ground with a sickening thud. He leapt to his feet as the woman wearing red closed in, and a couple of men in the office slid over the slippery, snowy floor towards him. Once more Davy was on the chair, reaching desperately for the tall top of the massive cabinet. He leapt in the air, and his fingers felt the icy, snowy top, and clutched the narrow rim there. His legs swung in mid-air. He hoisted himself up the slippery side of the cabinet, just out of reach of the woman, who jumped to catch his dangling foot, and missed. He pulled himself onto the small space at the top of the casement, and crouched in the snow. He was very glad of the snowsuit Mrs. Joyce had given him. Merely an arm's reach away was the master switch. A man was already scrambling onto the chair, reaching for him, but Davy was just out of reach if he pressed himself into the back of the shelf above the cabinet. Another man was dispatched to fetch something. They called to each other in their own language, and while Davy didn't understand what they were saying, being out of reach of Mrs. Joyce and her handy translating service, he thought they were probably going to fetch a ladder, or perhaps reinforcements. Davy glanced at his watch, which was still counting down the final minutes. There were only seconds to go. Very soon they would run out of time, or he would be caught. He only had one chance to input the right code for the master switch. Like Harry, Davy carried and relied on the Key to Life book, and he had made the most of his time in the storeroom searching it and understanding this final save code. Slowly and carefully he tapped the numbers 01, 16, 31 onto the keypad. Chapter 20. In the storeroom, while Davy made his way to the master switch and tried to input the correct save code, Mrs. Joyce and Harry faced the enemy agents. They were formidable and very angry, but their anger quickly turned to astonishment when they found an old lady and a young boy in the storeroom, in sophisticated high-tech snowsuits, with an assortment of accessories that made no sense to them whatsoever, especially the pine cone, which intrigued them considerably. They clearly didn't know what to do with the two of them, whether to treat them as a serious threat or a bewildering mistake. Harry and Mrs. Joyce heard their entire conversation translated into English and transmitted to their earpieces. Harry didn't need to be told by Mrs. Joyce to act dumb and not to use his spy gear unless necessary. The pointing, gesturing, disbelieving guards were gawping at the broken window, at the snow bomb pumping snow from outside into the computer room, at the strange pine cone device with trailing wires, and at the two of them, wondering if they had anything to do with any of it, and if so, how. The Cacobanjoians quickly dismantled the hose so that the snow stopped pumping into the computer room. Harry and Mrs. Joyce surreptitiously backed away from the guards into the corner nearest the window. The guards put away their guns and continued talking to each other in Cacobanjoian. Mrs. Joyce and Harry still heard the translation of the conversation. "Keep them under guard," suggested one. "We could let them go," said another. "How could they go for help in this snow? They'll only be a nuisance here, and we've nearly finished the initial phase anyway. After that, there's not much the likes of them can do." "No, we keep an eye on them," said the one who seemed to be in charge. "I don't like this at all. Too suspicious, them turning up at the same time as we're completing the takeover." "But they couldn't possibly know. They're harmless, look at them. They're clueless. It must have been the other one, the lad you found in the tunnel. He's the clever one. He must have done this." "But please," Mrs. Joyce said in her best imitation of a fragile, frightened old lady who is speaking to people who don't know English. We lost. You help?" "How did you come here?" asked the head guard sternly, suddenly speaking remarkably good English. "We got lost in the snow," said Mrs Joyce. "We spotted a window and—" It was going to be very difficult to explain how she happened to be able to remove bars and cut a neat hole in the glass as she was passing by and lost in the snow, and also to explain the snowmobile parked outside, if it wasn't completely buried in snow by now. But thankfully Mrs Joyce didn't have to explain. At that moment, from within the computer mainframe room, came the sound of shouting and yelling. It was coupled with a loud, unhealthy, grinding sound as the booming vibration of the largest snow bomb began to falter. The guards all rushed back into the computer room. Immediately Mrs Joyce sprang into action. She shoved Harry towards the broken window and hoisted him up. Harry pushed at the section of glass which had previously been removed and then stuck back again, and it fell outwards, vanishing into the snow. He scrambled through, and Mrs Joyce grabbed a couple of boxes, climbed them and leapt for the gap in the glass. She landed in a snowdrift and sprawled on the ground. "I really am getting too old for this," she said. Harry looked around. The snowmobile was covered in snow, but the snow was slowing down. "It's stopping," he said. "It's Davy," said Mrs Joyce, getting quickly to her feet. "He's done it. He's taken control of the master switch, and it's affected the snow bombs too. But we must hurry." Behind them, they could hear guards returning to the storeroom. "Quickly, Harry!" Mrs Joyce was only a couple of strides away. A guard had reached the broken window and was scrambling after them. Harry leapt onto the snowmobile. Mrs Joyce was just behind. Harry, this time making sure the speed lever was set at still, pressed the start button and the quiet machine growled, raring to go. He looked back for his friend, holding out his hand for her. "Go!" shouted Mrs Joyce. The guard was gaining on Mrs Joyce, flinging himself at her as she made for the snowmobile. "Go!" shouted Mrs Joyce again. But Harry didn't go. Mrs Joyce was caught. Chapter 21. There was a barked command. "Put your hands up." Harry slid off the snowmobile and put up his hands. "Not you, Harry," said Mrs Joyce. Then she addressed the man who had given the command, who stood at the side of the building with a gun in his hands. "Well, you took your time," she said. Several agents in thick combat suits materialized from around the various units in the business park and came towards them. They were all holding guns. "I'm sure you had everything under control, H," said the first man, smiling. He gestured to his team to take care of the guard, and they handcuffed him, and then quickly surrounded the building and guarded the broken window. "It was down to the wire," said Mrs Joyce grimly. "Sorry we weren't here sooner. Several preparations to make, and no one was sure how seriously to take one crazy old lady," finished Mrs Joyce dryly. The man muttered that they had every faith in Mrs Joyce's abilities, and that they had, in fact, been close by the entire time, monitoring the situation. Mrs Joyce nodded, and a smile peeped out. "I thought as much," she said. "I thought it was you at the wheel of that ridiculous four-wheel drive vehicle earlier on. You really should slow down on the road, Winnow. And you might invest in, or invent, a new car," retorted Winnow. Harry looked again at the man, Winnow. Yes, he was the intimidating man in dark glasses who had roared down the track to the business park. Harry had wondered whether he was an enemy agent, not one on their side. What had he and his men been doing all this time? "You could probably hear everything we've been up to the entire time," Mrs Joyce was saying, but she sounded more amused than cross. "Honestly, making us do all the work and then turning up for the glory." "Not quite," said the man. We have been working in very difficult conditions to infiltrate this place so that we clean up this gang properly. And we didn't have the Arctic equipment you appear to have, which is a subject I would like to discuss with you when we've got time." Harry realized that the combat suits, bulletproof vests, and boots the agents were wearing were intended for action, but weren't exactly suited to extreme snow. The men and women in them looked damp and cold. Mrs. Joyce was suddenly anxious to change the subject. She didn't seem keen to share her secret inventory of spy supplies with this official. Instead, she turned to Harry. "Harry, this is Winnow," she said. "You've got plenty to thank this boy for, Winnow, and the one inside who managed to reach the master switch and input the save code. Ah, here he is now." Davy was scrambling through the hole in the window, and Winnow gestured his men back and pulled him to his feet. "They're trying to head down the tunnel," Davy said, panting. "They left me and made a run for it. You'll never catch them here. They must be going out the way they managed to dig in." "Good lad," said Winnow. "We'll catch them all right. We haven't been idle." He addressed Mrs. Joyce as he said this. "We've found their tunnel entrance, and I've already got some of my team guarding it." He barked a command into the device on his wrist, and, to his surprise, Harry heard it faintly echoed from Mrs. Joyce's rucksack. "Up to your old tricks, H?" asked Winnow. "What have you improvised with this time?" "Pine cones," said Mrs. Joyce. "And I don't suppose you'll share your methods, or where you got that suit you're wearing, or this snowmobile?" "It's classified," said Mrs. Joyce, and she winked at Harry. "And you, lad," said Winnow, turning to Davy. "How did you learn enough to know the save code for the master switch?" Davy shrugged modestly. "I follow the Key to Life book," he said. Harry touched his own book, safe and secure in the pouch on his belt. He never wanted to be without it. "Davy's one of the best computer minds in the country," said Mrs. Joyce. "This young man would like a job in MI5 or MI6 if you've got a place for him." "I'm sure we can find," began Winnow. But, surprisingly, Davy was shaking his head. "Not any more," he said. "Sorry, sir, but I think I know what I want to do now." "Davy," said Mrs. Joyce, "you should make the most of this opportunity." "I am, ma'am," said Davy. "I want to work for you." While Winnow was busy issuing commands and directing his men in the clear-up operation, Harry and Davy helped Mrs. Joyce put away the snowmobile, which didn't have enough battery to take them all the way home, and the other supplies too, into the sheltered store that belonged to Secret Garden Flowers. They would collect them another time. "The flower folk will understand," said Mrs. Joyce. Harry wondered about Davy's comment that all the businesses here were undercover, working in one way or another for the government. He was inclined to think it might be true. They were leaving Davy at the business park to clear up the rest of Mrs. Joyce's belongings, including the snowmobile Harry had been forced to abandon in the forest. Davy had already started working for Mrs. Joyce. "No wild adventures on it, mind," warned Mrs. Joyce. Davy laughed, and Harry could imagine him speeding through the night, experimenting on those marvellous snowmobiles while the snow lasted. Davy's reward for his heroic actions in helping to save the country was that he was allowed to officially work with Mrs. Joyce from now on inventions and listening devices, and communications, and all sorts of other interesting and imaginative things. He would even be paid for it. Mrs. Joyce promised to report to Winnow, and not to keep too many exciting inventions secret from him. As they were leaving the store of flower supplies, Harry noticed a lady's scarf that had been left behind. It was brightly coloured, and he particularly noticed the pattern because Mum had one just like it. Hers had a small tear on one side of it, which Mum was always meaning to mend. As Mrs Joyce gave Davy his instructions, Harry gently pulled the scarf free. It had exactly the same tear as Mum's. Mum worked at a flower place, but was it possible that she worked here, under cover for the government? Chapter 22. The capture of the enemy spies was straightforward enough. The government agents did their work efficiently, and, to the surprise of the customers snowed inside the Crooked Man Inn, several shivering people in handcuffs were marched through the front doors of the inn from the very snowy night. They were followed by several other serious-looking men and women, who weren't exactly the police, but definitely appeared to be in authority. The handcuffed gang were then locked in a back room of the inn. I don't know what you would have thought if you'd been in the inn in Little London that strange, snowy evening. Would anyone believe you if you told them the story? No one in Little London knew what to talk about the most after that astonishing December day, the incredible fall of snow, or the sudden appearance of people in handcuffs. But it ended up being the snow. I'm afraid no one who had not been there really believed the story about the captured gang. They thought it must be wildly exaggerated. The old lady, accompanied by a boy, who appeared from the direction of the inn's toilets after the prisoners had been locked in a back room, drew no attention and no remark at all. Mrs Joyce and Harry had come back to the inn through the secret passageways and changed out of their snowsuits in the washrooms, but nobody noticed them. In Harry's opinion, the authorities had an easy job compared to the adventures that he and Davy and Mrs Joyce had been through. He told Mrs Joyce what he thought as they walked back through the underground tunnels to the inn. "That's always the way," agreed Mrs Joyce, "but it's just as well there are folk like us around to save the day, even if others take the glory." Harry's reward was different to Davy's. Harry already felt that he worked for Mrs Joyce, so when Winnow asked him what he would like in recognition of his courage and initiative in foiling Operation Snow, "I'd like snow at Christmas, please," said Harry, "in case this all melts, or in case it hasn't got as far as my house." Winnow looked astonished and perturbed. Mrs Joyce laughed. "Well, you did ask, Winnow," she said. "Personally, I don't see why it shouldn't be done. Where's the harm in it?" "Well," Winnow cleared his throat, "I'm afraid the snow bombs and various other accessories will all be destroyed before then. We have certain regulations to follow, and we can't allow further use of—" "Well, really, what nonsense," protested Mrs Joyce. "One small snow bomb couldn't do that much harm." Winnow quickly replied, "Speaking of which, where did you get the snow bomb you planted in the cupboard? I think if we were to investigate its origins, we might have plenty of questions to ask you." Mrs Joyce hastily interrupted Winnow. It was clear she did not want her own inventions interfered with by officials. She diverted attention back to Harry. "Anything else you would like, Harry? I'm sure you can think of something." "Could I be snowed out of school then, please?" asked Harry. "We really can't." Winnow's explanation of how impossible this would be, and how many regulations might be broken, and what about the risk assessment this would involve, and plenty of other things, were all firmly disagreed with by Mrs Joyce. "We'll see what we can do," she said. Chapter 23. The roads were completely impassable in and around the village of Little London. The lounge of the Crooked Man Inn was warm and crowded. They were doing a roaring trade, as the people there were snowed in. There was nowhere they could go. In the front car park, all the cars were buried in deep snow, including Mrs Joyce's car. Harry wondered whether they would have to sit and wait, but Mrs Joyce led the way out of the inn, into the cold, snowy night. The snow had stopped falling. Everything was buried beneath at least a metre of snow. "We'll use my car," Mrs Joyce said. Harry looked at the small, battered car, buried in such deep snow that only a small part of the windscreen, windows, and the roof were visible. Even a tractor couldn't get through this snow. But just when Harry thought he would never be surprised at Mrs Joyce again, she pressed a button on her old-fashioned car key fob, which looked like it was broken and wouldn't do anything at all. A quiet hissing began, like the sound of air inflating something, which was precisely what was happening. The little old car began to vibrate and grow, sending inches of snow tumbling from it. Up and up into the air the car went, higher and higher, until it was clear of the snow. The tyres were completely encased in two massive inflatable runners. It was the strangest sleigh you could possibly imagine. Harry had no words or questions left. Everything Mrs Joyce did seemed extraordinary, so that highly unusual things began to feel as if they should be quite normal. When the car door popped open and a dainty rope ladder dropped down to his feet, it felt like a usual thing to climb it to reach the front passenger seat of the car. He ignored the fact that he was covered in snow. Suddenly he was very tired and very hungry. As Mrs Joyce began to drive the car smoothly over the snow, they ate the leftover sandwiches and all the biscuits. Then Harry transferred the pine-cone device from the rucksack Mrs Joyce had lent him to his school rucksack. He didn't know if it would continue to work, but he wanted to keep it anyway. Harry didn't bother looking back to see if anyone in the inn had observed the incredible sight of an old lady driving her car quite easily over the top of so much snow. But since it didn't feature in the village chatter that followed for weeks, it's safe to assume they hadn't. There were, however, some very puzzling tracks left in the snow which nobody could explain. The local newspaper ran a piece about unknown sleigh tracks in their hastily printed special edition, which contained all the stories of that incredible night in Little London. But the paper was so full of fantastic accounts of that strange afternoon that this one was never pursued. A mile outside of Little London there was much less snow. A mile further, approaching the outskirts of Bramley Hedge, there was even less. Mrs Joyce's car adapted to the depth of snow as they travelled. The inflated runners shrank as the snow disappeared, the car moved gently downwards, and the tyres re-emerged and drove normally along the road again. By the time they had snaked through the pleasant residential roads of Bramley Hedge, and taken the back road past Missel Hall ruins, a meagre inch of snow was coating the countryside. Beyond Missel Hall, approaching the familiar site of Lower Misling and home, there was hardly even a sprinkling. At Harry's house, and at Mrs Joyce's house next door, a few spots of rain were falling. By morning, the snow at Harry's house would be gone. Mrs Joyce parked in her driveway. It was 7:50 p.m. "We're home in time with 10 minutes to spare," she said. "Thanks for the sandwiches, Mrs Joyce," said Harry. "Thank you for the adventure, Harry," returned Mrs Joyce. "I couldn't have done it without you." Chapter 24. It didn't seem possible that the normal world, made up of Harry's home and family and other familiar things, was completely undisturbed after all he'd been through since school that day. But it seemed that it was. "Did you have a nice time?" asked Mum. "Yes," said Harry. His tummy was still growling and hungry. "Could I have some toast, please?" "Yes, dear," said Mum. "Did you see the snow earlier?" Harry nodded. "But I think it's going now," he said gloomily. "So it seems," agreed Mum. "I dare say it'll all be gone tomorrow." Harry made toast, 1 piece with honey, 1 piece with marmalade, added a rock bun, which was stale and in a pile of goodies for the hens, and sat at the kitchen table and thought about his strange day. He wondered what was happening in the world of spies and secret agents, and what the captured gang had revealed. Dad was listening to the news in the background, and Harry heard about the unexpected heavy snowfalls in several unconnected locations in the UK, except that he knew they were connected. They were all important government premises. The newsreader was saying, "So far, we have reports of isolated blizzards in 7 locations. This unlikely weather phenomenon has not yet been fully explained by meteorological experts, but there is certain to be speculation that these bizarre extreme weather anomalies provide further evidence of global warming. Previously, the effect of greenhouse gas emissions was considered global, not local, but no doubt scientists will be examining this new evidence of localized climate change in the coming weeks. Already, campaigners from climate protection groups are calling on the government to take decisive action and reduce the emission of damaging greenhouse gases. There are several alternative theories about the isolated blizzards, including speculation by the leading highly respected investigative reporter, Artie Robertson, that the weather patterns are somehow linked to terrorist activities, but the government has denied this. It's natural that people think of terrorism of one kind or another when disruption occurs, but we can assure you that there is no evidence to cause concern, and we fully expect these unusual weather patterns to quickly pass, said a government spokesperson. The advice for those in the affected areas is to keep warm and stay out of the storm. Experts are confident none of the isolated blizzards will last long. Harry tuned out of the report. What a lot of nonsense was being repeated by people who should know better. No one apart from Artie Robertson had got close to the truth. And while he was glad that the terrorists had been defeated, he was secretly sorry the whole snowy adventure was over. He didn't think he was likely to get his wish of being snowed out of school. He had a hunch they would be containing and destroying snow bombs until they were all gone or securely locked away. "Time for bed, Harry," said Mum. "School tomorrow." Harry sighed. He cleared away his dishes and went upstairs to bed. He only remembered when he got there that he had forgotten to ask Mum about the scarf which looked like hers, that he had seen in the flower place. Probably she just worked there. It seemed so unlikely that Mum knew anything about plots and enemies and real spies. Perhaps he shouldn't mention it, in case she wondered what he was doing there. Although Mrs Joyce had said something about secret garden flowers being a reliable espionage service, but probably she was only teasing him. And by the time he had finished thinking this, Harry was asleep. Mum watched Harry go to bed. Then she picked up Harry's school rucksack to put it away. She dislodged the contents as she moved the bag, and out rolled a gold-sprayed pine cone with wires trailing from it. She smiled and put it back inside his rucksack again. "I'm glad these came in useful anyway," she said to herself. "No doubt I'll hear all about it from Joyce." Chapter 25. Have you ever woken up in the morning and felt like it might be a gloomy day? Like the feeling that Christmas is over, or that you're going back to school after the holidays? Nothing feels quite right. That was exactly how Harry felt the morning after his adventure. Outside it was dull and mild. The snow had melted in the night. It didn't look like there would be any more. Harry wasn't going to get his wish to be snowed off school. He ate his breakfast of cornflakes and toast, while his big brother and sisters also bemoaned the lack of snow and wondered whether it would come back in time for Christmas. Harry munched his cornflakes in silence. He didn't think it would. They drove the familiar, quiet country roads to school, the same roads that Harry had driven with Mrs Joyce only last night. There was not a flake of snow to be seen, even in the cooler, shady places, like under the clustering trees by Mizzle Hall, where the snow often hid for longer. The outskirts of Bramley Hedge looked as they always did, as if they were utterly untouched by anything extraordinary. It was as if the whole adventure had been a dream. Mum turned the car right just beyond the quaint church and wove through the row of sedate houses to reach the final turn for Harry's school. And when they turned the final corner, snow! Spread over the entire school premises were deep drifts of beautiful white snow. It was nowhere else. It hadn't touched the houses that were closest to the school grounds. It started at the school gates and stopped at the fence which enclosed the school boundaries. It was as if a snowstorm intended for the whole of Bramley Hedge had got confused and dumped its whole load by mistake right over one small school. Already children were diving in and out of it, throwing snowballs, building a snowman, getting soaking wet, yelling, shouting, celebrating, and a couple of kids who had got hit by hard snowballs were crying. The headmistress stood at the school gate, shivering in her inadequate jacket. She didn't realize she should have dressed for snow today. She was talking to parents who arrived, explaining the situation. "It must be one of the isolated blizzards they were talking about on the news," she said to Harry's mum. "The heating is frozen and formal school is cancelled for the day. However, the children are welcome to play in the snow before they go home." And that's what they did. They had a morning of play at school, getting their fill of glorious snow, and then Mum took Harry home. When Harry could, he went to the spy hole in the fence that bordered Mrs Joyce's house. Lodged in the hole was a small piece of paper. Harry read what it said. "Sorry I couldn't arrange more snow. There was only enough for the school, but hope it helped anyway. H." Harry liked the H. He still didn't know what it stood for, but the important thing was that it was Mrs Joyce's official spy tag. It meant, he hoped, that he was really, truly working for her now, like Davy. One day he hoped to have his own spy tag. He got out his handy pencil, and at the bottom of Mrs Joyce's note scribbled a reply. It was simple and to the point. "Thank you very much. H.2." Epilogue. There are perhaps a few bits and pieces to comment on before we leave this story. If you were wondering about the ladies at the bus stop and what happened to them, I should tell you that they were innocent bystanders and nothing whatsoever to do with the adventure. They caught their bus, which arrived late, out of Little London before the blizzard started, and were completely unaware that they had only just missed a very snowy adventure. As Mrs Joyce occasionally remarked, sometimes people are exactly what they seem, ordinary people. Unfortunately, both the remote control cameras were lost. Mrs Joyce suspects that government agents took the one by the snow bomb when they were clearing up. They're probably still investigating how to copy it. The one that was placed by the bus stop was never discovered. It was buried beneath snow, and when this melted, even Davy, with a specially invented metal detector, couldn't find it. Perhaps it will reappear again in a future adventure. Davy's family, all of whom were clever inventors, and some of whom worked in secret government services, became good friends with Mrs Joyce, and Davy became her valuable personal assistant. The two of them developed many wonderful inventions, some of which went on to be used by the authorities. Others they kept secret. All of them are ready and waiting for another adventure. Harry, of course, is always ready for another adventure too. I should also mention that, to Harry's delight, there was snow that Christmas. It was strangely localized, and there was a small article in the local paper that speculated it was another of the isolated blizzard phenomena. Mrs Joyce denied all knowledge. Davy didn't say a word. But following the isolated fall of snow that Christmas, there were no more isolated weather phenomena. It seemed that the government had successfully contained or destroyed them all. Unless you're suspicious about the fabulous fall of snow that occurred exactly when Mrs Joyce went skiing with Davy's family the following year. For the moment, the danger to the country's computer system seems to have passed. Lessons and codes in Harry the Spy. You must be wondering what the codes in this book mean, and what the Key to Life book is about. Listen on, and the hidden meaning of the story, and all the codes that have been used, will be explained. General lessons from the story. First, a bit about the truth this story is intended to illustrate, which is the central message of the Bible about God's gift of salvation to every person in the world. It's not intended to be a detailed illustration, just a general picture, which can be summarized like this. In the story, the computer mainframe, the mind that controls the country, represents you and me. There is a fight between good and evil for control of this great mind. The enemy computer hackers want to take it over and use it for their own evil purposes. Actually, this bit isn't completely accurate because, in our case, each one of us is already under enemy control. That is, we are born sinners, those who fall short of God's holy standards, and are in rebellion against our Creator, the God of heaven. It's as if a computer hacker is at the controls of our lives, pressing keys that mean that we choose to go against the law of God and want to go our own way instead. We want to think what we like, act as we like, set our own standards, decide our own values, and basically do without God's standards altogether. We are all crooked against the straight measuring line of God's law. Incidentally, this is why the inn where the search for the truth, or the way of saving the nation, starts, is called the Crooked Man. But this way of life, going against God, brings us no peace and no lasting happiness. We are all guilty of sin against God and deserving of His punishment. We all need a new controller of our lives in order to be right with God and one day be in heaven. But against the gloom and doom of this background enter those with the Key to Life book, which represents the Bible. They know how to save and take back control of the computer. In our case, God has already worked out and completed the way of salvation for everyone who will accept it. Thankfully, God didn't set up secret codes and make it hard and mysterious to come back to Him. In fact, He made it very clear and simple, and accessible to every person in the world. He sent His Son, the Lord Jesus, as a perfect sacrifice for sin. When the Lord Jesus died on the cross, He paid the price for all sin. He is now available as a Saviour for anyone who trusts in Him to save them. By repenting of our sin and trusting in the Lord Jesus, we are accepting the way that God made for us to be right with Him, and we're accepting the price the Lord Jesus paid for sin on our behalf. then we have a new controller. We're reset. We're a new creation in the Lord Jesus, someone who can serve and please God and one day go to heaven. We will have peace and satisfaction that nothing else will bring. The codes on the doors that Harry must go through are all from the Key to Life book. They are all verses from the Bible, which help us to understand God's way of salvation. Keep listening to discover more detail about the door entry codes. Door Entry Code 1. The first door Harry goes through is difficult to find. It's out of the way in a cupboard, and it's also disguised, narrow and confined. It doesn't seem like the right way at all, and it's certainly not the glamorous entrance he might expect to a splendid adventure which is about saving his country. Harry even dismisses the cupboard door as the wrong one to start with. The code on this hidden narrow door is 130714. This stands for Matthew, M is the 13th letter of the alphabet, chapter 7, verse 14. Narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. While the way of God's salvation is clear and simple, people still don't like to find it. Anyone who chooses it must come in repentance and humility to God, admitting they are wrong and that He is right in everything He has said and done. We don't like to admit we're wrong and that our sins, all the things we have done wrong which fall short of God's standards, have come between us and God. Plenty of people think there must be another way that they can please God. They want to do good deeds or become religious and come to Him on their own terms. Nobody finds it easy to admit they're wrong and that there's nothing they can do to make themselves right again. Which is explained by the second door. Door Entry Code 2. The second door is at the end of a corridor, which at first seems harmless enough, then becomes increasingly sinister as reflections of Harry begin to look dirty and grotesque and even frightening, so that Harry can't bear to look at this depiction of himself. Once more, the key to finding the code for this door is found in the Key to Life book, the Bible. The code for this door is 180323. That is Romans, R is the 18th letter of the alphabet, chapter 3, verse 23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The teaching of the Bible is that every human being, apart from the Lord Jesus, who is the Son of God, has done wrong, sinned, and continually come short of God's standards. It's a difficult thing to face. It requires us to see ourselves as God sees us, clothed in all the wrong things we have done and thought and said, and that are inside each one of us. Harry saw himself as grotesque and didn't want to continue and go through the door. It's hard for us to admit that we have done wrong according to God's perfect standards and need a Saviour to be made right again. The open doors. Harry then passes through two doors, the trapdoor and the ancient door in the church which wasn't locked. Harry didn't need keys or codes for these. Once we have admitted that the Bible is right in its assessment of how sinful and guilty we are, the way is clear for us to proceed and find the truth. Sometimes we receive help along the way, as Harry did from Davy, who had unlocked the ancient church door before him, although Harry didn't initially realize Davy was a friend who could help him. Door Entry Code 3. Remember the hatch that Harry climbed through to escape from the enemy and get to the outside world again? This also required a code. Harry knew the key for this off by heart. The code for the way of escape was 10-10-09, which stands for John, J is the 10th letter of the alphabet, chapter 10, verse 9. I am the door. The person who enters through me will be saved. There are many verses in the Bible which explain to us God's way of salvation, but there is only one way. In the Bible, the Lord Jesus is described as our Saviour, our way of escape from the punishment we all deserve for sin. This is why he spoke of himself as the door. It is one thing realizing that we are wrong before God and need to be made right, but the next step is to understand that there is a way ready for us, provided and approved of by God and available to everyone in the world. The Lord Jesus himself is the way. John chapter 14 verse 6 in the Bible. When we trust in him, we are saved from God's judgment. This is explained by the final save code. Code 4. The master switch save code. The final code is the one used to access the master switch, which took back control of the computer system. This time, it's up to Davy to figure out the code, and of course, he also relies on the Key to Life book, which contains the only true codes. The code is 01-16-31, meaning Acts chapter 16, verse 31. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. This is the way of salvation, which God provided for us to be right with him forever. It is through the Lord Jesus, who died to bear the punishment for sin. When we trust in the Lord Jesus, we are saved. This is the end of Harry the Spy, The Mysterious Snow. This book is available as a print book, ebook, and audiobook. If you'd like more information about this book, or about similar books by E.M. Wilkie, please visit www.aletheabooks.co.